The 100 Days by Patrick O'Brien. Read for you by Robert Hardy.
The sudden rearmament that followed Napoleon's escape from Elba had done little to thin the ranks of unemployed sea officers by the early spring of 1815. A man of war stripped and laid up cannot be made ready for sea in a matter of weeks, and the best vantage points in Gibraltar were now crowded with gentlemen on half-pay who'd gathered to watch the long-expected arrival of Commodore Aubrey's squadron from Madeira, recalled in haste from what was ostensibly an expedition to survey the coasts of Chile. The squadron would do something to refurnish the great bare stretch of water inside the mole. An extraordinary nakedness emphasized by the presence of a few hulks, the Royal Sovereign wearing the flag of the Commander-in-Chief, and a couple of lonely 74s. It was a beautiful day, with a slight but favourable breeze at last, and all eyes were fixed upon the middle distance where the squadron had come about on the starboard tack. Among the watchers were two elderly naval lieutenants, who could no longer bear the English climate, and who found their £127 15 shillings a year went much farther here. "The breeze is veering again," said the first. "It'll be abaft the beam directly. They'll be in on this leg, sure. In at last, poor souls. Briseis kept them hanging about in Funchal until they'd almost grounded on their own beef bone. She was always overmasted, and I cannot congratulate her on that botched-together bowsprit. Marsham has always oversteeved his bowsprits. Nor on her new fore-topmast. That boatswain must have died. Briseis, surprised, she must have been called back into service. Mahon wearing Commodore Jack Aubrey's broad pennant. Dover, Ganymede. Dover was fitted as a troop ship, and now she's changing herself back into a frigate. What a shambles!" The breeze came aft, and the whole squadron flashed out studding sails, a glorious sight. Yet now the current was against them, and in spite of their fine spread of canvas, they made but little headway. Presently Lieutenant John Arrowsmith, 2 months senior to his friend Thomas Edwards, said, "D'you see Surprise start her stunsail sheet not to outrun her station? Aye, she was always a wonderfully swift sailor, and now they've done her proud. Webster saw her in Sepping's yard where they were fitting her out regardless, fitting her for a hydrographical voyage. Ah, lovely little craft." Presently Arrowsmith clapped his glass to and said, "Did you ever meet Dr. Maturin?" "I don't know that I did. A very clever doctor, they say, called in to treat Prince William. Always sails with Jack Aubrey. That's the man. Well, he has a wife. They live with the Aubreys at his big place in Dorset, but of course you know it being a Dorset man. Yes, Walcombe. I've been to 1 or 2 of the Blackstones' meets there, and we used to see Mrs. Aubrey and Mrs. Maturin at the Dorchester Assembly. Mrs. Maturin breeds Arabs, a very good horsewoman." "Well, so they said. But you know a place called Maiden Oscott?" "Only too well, with its damned awkward bridge. It seems she pitched over the whole shooting match, coat, horses and all, right down into the river. And only the groom was brought out alive." "Oh, my God!" cried Edwards, and after a pause, "My wife disliked her, but she was a beautiful woman. God rest her. I doubt I ever see her like again." As the squadron drew inshore, the watching crowd increased. Edwards caught sight of his friend's daughters pushing through the crowd. "Oh, Papa!" cried the elder girl. "Which is the Surprise?" "The second in the line, my dear." The young lady trained her father's telescope on the Surprise. "Is that the famous Captain Aubrey?" she asked. "Why? He's short, fat and red-faced. I am disappointed." "No, booby," said her father. "The Commodore's aboard the pennant ship, Mahon. Don't you see the broad pennant, eh?" "Oh, yes, sir, I see it," she replied, training her glass on Mahon's quarter-deck. Who is the very tall, fair-haired man wearing a Rear Admiral's uniform? Why, Lizzie, that is your famous Jack Aubrey. Oh, isn't he beautiful? Molly Butler had a coloured engraving of him boarding the Torgood, sword in hand, and the great girls at school— What the great girls said was lost in the Pomone's 17-gun salute to the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Keith. The echo of the last report had not disappeared before the towering flagship began her 15-gun reply. Captain Buchan, who commanded the Royal Sovereign, ushered Jack Aubrey below to the Admiral's splendid quarters, but rather than the very large Commander-in-Chief there rose a diaphanous cloud of blue tulle that enveloped a particularly tall and elegant woman. "Dearest Jack," she said, they having kissed, "how very happy I am to see you wearing a broad pennant. It was a damn near-run thing that you were not halfway to Tierra del Fuego in a mere hydrographical tub. But how we ever came to miss you on common hard I shall never understand. True, Keith was in a great taking about the naval estimates, and I was turning some obscure lines of Ennius in my head, without being able to make any sense of them, but even so, nor shall I ever understand how I came to be such an oaf as to ask you how you did without the slightest word of congratulations on being a Viscountess. Yet it had been in my head all the way across. Give you joy with all my heart, dear Queenie," he said, kissing her again. Jack was taller than Queenie, and having been in the wars and much battered, he now looked older. He was, in fact, 7 years her junior, and there had been a time when he was a very little boy, whose ears she boxed for impertinence, and whose nightmares she would soothe by taking him into her bed. A cloud passed over her face. "Tell me, how is poor dear Maturin?" "He looks older, but he bears up wonderfully. And it's not done away with his love of music. He eats nothing, though, and when he came back to Funchal, having attended to everything at Woolcombe, I lifted him out of the boat with one hand. She was an extraordinarily handsome woman, and I admired her exceedingly. But she was not a wife for him, nor a mother for that dear little girl. How is she? Bridget does not seem gravely upset, from what I understand. She's very deeply attached to Sophie, you know." A pause. "If he does not eat, he will grow weak and pine away," said Lady Keith. "We have a famous cook aboard. Would an invitation be acceptable, do you think? Just a few very old friends. Oh, and Jack, there is something I must tell you just between ourselves. Another Mediterranean command would be too much for Keith. So we're only here until Pellew comes out, though we shall stay in the governor's cottage a while to enjoy the spring." "My dear Aubrey," cried the Admiral, walking in, "how glad I am to see you!" "And I to see you, my Lord Viscount. My heartiest congratulations." Thank ye, Aubrey," said the Admiral. "Have you heard? 600,000 people cheered Napoleon when he entered Paris. Ney has joined him. 150,000 King's troops have done the same. There's the devil to pay, and no tar hot. Is Dr. Maturin with you?" "Yes, sir." "Is he up to talking with my secretary and the politicos?" "I believe so. Although he shuns ordinary company, he's dead set on bringing Napoleon down. That's what keeps him alive, it seems to me. Poor dear man. Now then, Aubrey, you'll have to cut yourself in 3 to do half the things I want. A damned complex situation. I'll give you the broadest view." Lady Keith gathered up her belongings. "My dear, I will leave you to it." The broadest view was, very roughly, this. Wellington, with 93,000 British and Dutch troops, and Blücher, with 116,000 Prussians, were in the Low Countries, waiting until Schwarzenberg, with 210,000 Austrians, and Barclay de Tolly, slowly advancing with 150,000 Russians, should reach the Rhine, when, in principle, the Allies were to invade France. For his part, Napoleon had about 360,000 men. Yet he had battered Prussians, Austrians, and Russians again and again against far greater odds. The Admiral's worn face told Jack a great deal. "Still, this is the soldiers' business. We have our own concern. The attitude of the French Navy varies from ship to ship. They are extremely susceptible, and any untoward incident might have disastrous results, but far worse is this building of French men-of-war in the Adriatic ports with Bonapartist officers and men standing by to take them over. But payment, sir, even a corvette costs a great deal of money, and there is talk of 2 heavy frigates. Aye, there is something very odd about it all. Our intelligence people see a Muslim influence. There is much activity in Algiers, Tunis, and on the Moroccan coast, fermented by Napoleonic renegados with native craft and vessels up to the size of a sloop of war. Already it's most harmful to Allied trade, and if Bonaparte can knock out the Russians or part of the Austrians, the French Navy may sweep us out of the Mediterranean again. In the first place, Aubrey, you must allot a force adequate for the protection of the Constantinople trade. The Algerians in particular have grown very bold, while other Corsairs push up from Salé and pass the straits in the dark of the moon. You must prevent any unauthorized movement to the best of your ability. But your most important task by far is to look into those Adriatic ports you know so well. Even the small places are capable of building a frigate. If any 2-deckers have declared for Napoleon, you must not venture upon an action, but send to me without the loss of a moment. Where frigates, corvettes, or sloops are concerned, you must endeavour to stop the building and obtain their disarmament, all of which requires the utmost degree of tact. Though if there's a clearly expressed intent of joining Bonaparte, you must burn, sink, or destroy, as usual." "Aye, aye, sir," said Jack, and then, "My lord, may I beg for my tender Ringle to be sent out? William Reed handles her very well indeed, and I shall have the utmost need for such a craft." "Certainly," said the Admiral. I do not wish to be importunate, but if you feel you could convey some sense of our feeling, our concern, our sympathy to Maturin, pray do so. In any case, I look forward to learning his views on the situation this evening after he's been closeted with the gentleman down from Whitehall." Lord Keith stood up. "You'll dine with us tomorrow, Aubrey?" Jack bowed. "Very happy." Preserved Killick, Captain Aubrey's steward, an ill-faced, ill-tempered, shrewish man who kept his officer's uniform, equipment, and silver in a state of exact, old-maidish order, and who did the same for Aubrey's close friend, Dr. Stephen Maturin, or even more so, since in the doctor's case Killick added a fretful nursemaid quality to his service, as though Maturin were not quite exactly. It is true that in the community of mariners the not quite exactly opinion was widely held, for although Stephen could now tell the difference between starboard and larboard, it still called for some reflection. This general view in no way affected their deep respect for him as a medical man. His work with a trephine or a saw excited universal admiration, and it was said that if he chose, he could save you although you were already 3 parts dead and mouldy. Furthermore, a small half of one of his boluses would blow the backside off a bullock. The placebo effect of this reputation had indeed preserved many a sadly shattered sailor, and he was much caressed aboard. A little before the evening gun, therefore, Preserved Killick walked into Stephen's cabin and found him sitting there in his drawers, an unused razor in front of him, and reading the coded message that had just arrived by courier from Sir Joseph Blaine, the Chief of Naval Intelligence. "Oh, sir!" cried Killick, but even as he exclaimed he choked the inborn shrew, lowering the sir to the gentlest tones of remonstrance. "Apart from the words, 'which the gentleman have been waiting 10 minutes,' Killick dressed him efficiently and led him to the captain's cabin, where Mr. Campbell, the Admiral's secretary, and the 2 gentlemen from Whitehall rose to greet him. William Kent was a familiar figure. The other, Mr. D., Stephen knew only from having seen him at a few restricted conferences at which he was treated with deference as an authority on Eastern matters, particularly finance. As they all sat down, William Kent began a summary that was essentially the same as Lord Keith's. With questioning, Stephen learned that the various rulers, commanders, and war offices were at odds, that secrecy about plans scarcely existed in the Austrian army, and that as opposed to the effervescent sense of returning glory in France, there was a total lack of enthusiasm in many of the Allied regiments, and something not far from mutiny among the Russians. Barclay de Tolly was doing all that a good soldier could do with his ill-equipped and discontented forces, but they were already 16 days behind the agreed timetable, and with an immense distance still to travel. There was also a fear of betrayal on the part of many of the subject nations that made up the Eastern powers. Mr. D reminded Kent of an ancient war in which a more numerous army made up of different nations had behaved in much the same way. His account went on, and gradually Stephen sank into his own reflections, all, necessarily, as painful as could be imagined. From time to time he was half aware that Mr. Campbell was trying to lead them back to the matter in hand by mentioning Caribago, Spalato, Ragusa, and other ports on the Adriatic shore that would represent a great danger once the French were out, when the voice of Kent pierced through with remarkable clarity. "A very important point is that eventually one of these ships might carry the treasure." "The treasure, sir?" He saw the three faces turn towards him, and at almost the same moment he saw their expressions turn to the grave, unobtrusive consideration that now surrounded him like a pall, ever since his loss became public knowledge. Kent cleared his throat, and the Admiral's secretary, excusing himself, withdrew. "Yes, sir, the treasure," said Kent, "a scheme planned by Dumanoir and his friends, to drive a Muslim wedge between the suspicious, slow-moving Austrian forces and the lingering Russians, preventing their junction, and thus disrupting the meeting of the Allies on the Rhine." He paused. "You will recall that Bonaparte professed himself a Muslim at the time of the Egyptian campaign. I remember it, sure. But the Grand Mufti took no notice whatsoever." "Very true," said D. "But Islam is a world as varied as our own miserable congeries of hostile sects, and some of the more remote hailed the news of his conversion with delight. Among these were certain heretical Shiite fraternities in European Turkey, particularly Albania, Monastir, and the region close to the northern frontier, whose interpretation of the Sunnah points to Napoleon as the hidden Imam, the Mahdi. The most extreme are the descendants and followers of the Sheikh al-Jabal, the old man of the mountains himself." "Then they are the true assassins," said Stephen with animation. "They are indeed, and although by no means so prominent as they were at the time of the Crusades, they are still a very dangerous body, even though the Fedais, the actual killers, amount to only a few score. The rest of the mercenaries in the plan we are discussing, though willing and eager to massacre unbelievers, are not moved by so pure a religious fervour that they will venture their skins free gratis. As soon as they see 2 months' pay laid before them, they will move, but not otherwise." "Is the sum very great?" "Enormous, far beyond anything the French can put down immediately." "Where is the money to come from?" "Ibn Hazm," said Mr. D., "the Shiite ruler of Asgar. To be sure, Asgar is small, but it is happily placed at the junction of 3 caravan routes, and the tolls levied are paid in gold. It is reported on very good authority that the gold has been promised, and that messengers have been sent to arrange the transport, probably from Algiers. 'Tis to be hoped that the Royal Navy will make it impossible for any disaffected French man of war to help the gold over the water, or for any vessel from the African shore to enter an Adriatic port." Mr. D. paused. "Pray go on, Mr. Kent." "Very well, sir. Dr. Maturin, when we were speaking of this matter with Sir Joseph and his colleagues, it was suggested that with your knowledge of these parts and of the Turkish officials governing, that you might cause this conspiracy to fail. The Ministry attaches great importance to the matter, and you could draw on the Treasury for very large sums indeed." He looked earnestly into Stephen's face. "One of those present said that you might decline on the grounds that your Turkish and Arabic did not meet your very high standards. Sir Joseph, though, was of opinion that a lieutenant capable of writing both these languages might induce you to agree. He said that Mr. D and he were acquainted with just such a person whose discretion could be guaranteed. A physical gentleman already known to you." "The gentleman is in Gibraltar at this moment, Doctor," said Mr. D. "A Spanish Jew brought up as an Orthodox Sephardi, which gave him not only the curious Spanish the Sephardim speak in Africa and the Turkish dominions, but Hebrew too, and Arabic, together with an equally fluent Turkish. But he studied in Paris before the Revolution. His principles grew more liberal, as one might say. Indeed, he quarrelled with the synagogue, and this has had a disastrous effect on his practice. But in earlier days, and out of mere kindness, he often used his linguistic skill to help one of our friends, and this assistance was put on a more formal basis. Since then he's carried out several missions for us, usually as a merchant in precious stones, and with his wide acquaintance, relations, medical skill, and so on, he's given very great satisfaction. We have, of course, tested his discretion in the usual way." During the time of this conference, Jack had been very much occupied with his squadron. On the way down from Madeira, he'd been aboard them repeatedly and had a fair notion of their captain's abilities, but it was still not clear how he should divide the ships for their separate duties. As far as the Adriatic was concerned, he would certainly shift his pennant into the Surprise, with her wonderful sailing qualities, her thoroughly reliable ship's company, capable of such a deadly rate of fire. But for his consort he could not decide between Pomone and Dover. The 30-gun Pomone was an unhappy ship whose captain was laid up in Funchal with a badly broken leg, and whose second lieutenant awaited trial tomorrow for an offence under the 29th Article of War, which dealt with unnatural and detestable sin. A ship to which Lord Keith had appointed a young man very recently made post, the only qualified officer at hand. Whatever the outcome of tomorrow's ugly trial, the Pomone's people would be very upset. The gig hooked on, and Jack ran up the frigate's side. He had seen the flagship's barge carrying the civilians away, and he relied on finding Stephen in the cabin. "Stephen," cried Jack, "the Admiral has a courier setting off for England within the hour. I've asked for William Reed to bring Ringle, and since he'll need a day or two's readying, he could ride over to Woolcombe taking messages. Indeed, if he will buy a fine bold hoop in Portsmouth and give it to Bridget with my love, I should be infinitely obliged to him. And if he would bring back my narwhal horn, I should be most uncommon grateful. I was contemplating on it in the night, for I'm told that in Mahon we're likely to meet that eminent engineer, metallurgist and natural philosopher James Wright, and I hope that he'll be able to tell me whether those whorls, or perhaps I should say those torsades, and those spirals running from the base almost to the tip, add strength or possibly elasticity to the whole improbable structure. Yes, and love to dear Sophie too, of course. Brother, I'm afraid you are low in your spirits. I do so hate a court-martial, above all one of this kind. Will you attend? Asked Jack. I will not. In any case, I have an appointment ashore. They gazed out of the great broad sweep of sternlights at the tawny rock itself, soaring away as unlikely and as impressive as ever. Jack, he went on with a significant expression, it is not impossible that I may bring an assistant surgeon back with me. If I am not mistaken entirely, it would not be fit that the gentleman should mess with the midshipmen and mates. So if he cannot be admitted to the gun-room, perhaps I might be indulged in his company as a guest. "Of course you may," said Jack, "but if he's a gentleman of a certain age and standing, I'm sure the gunroom would stretch a point. As far as standing goes, he is as much of a physician as myself, a doctor of medicine. We studied in Paris together. He was some years junior to me, but already highly considered as an anatomist and a tolerable musician." As the captain's barges were to be seen converging on the flagship, Stephen made his way along to Thompson's hotel. Dr. Jacob, opening his door at the knock, seized Stephen, kissed him on both cheeks, and led him into a cool, shaded room where a jug of hochata stood on a low table and smoke from the hookah hung from the ceiling. "I am exceedingly happy that it is you," said Jacob. "I was so nearly sure of it from Sir Joseph's calculated indiscretions that I brought you an example of the palma aponeurosis, the contractions which so interested you and Dupuytren." Realizing that his gift could not be fully appreciated in the half-light, he thrust open the balcony doors and led Stephen out into the brilliant sun. "You're altogether too good, dear Amos," said Stephen, gazing at the severed hand in its jar of spirits of wine, the middle fingers so hard-clenched against the palm that their nails had grown into the flesh. "I've never seen so perfect an example." Jacob, taking no notice, turned him gently to the full sun and looked hard into his face. "Stephen, you have not made some cruel self-diagnosis, I trust?" "I have not," said Stephen, and in as few words as possible he explained his personal situation. Amos did not oppress him with any sympathy other than a deeply affectionate pressure on the shoulder, but suggested they should walk out on the rock where they could speak about their present undertaking in safety. They walked up to the ridge itself where the cliffs fall down to Catalan Bay, and Stephen listened to all that Jacob had gathered about the Adriatic ports, the Muslim fraternities, and the money to pay their mercenaries. "But where Africa is concerned," he concluded, "it seems to me that nothing should be attempted until we have at least some success in the Adriatic." Stephen agreed, his eyes following a troop of black storks as they passed over the flagship. And quite suddenly he realized that the Royal Sovereign was no longer flying the court-martial signal. By the time they reached the town, there was no man hanging from the yardarm, but on the battlements this side of the Southport Gate there were several officers, including Jack Aubrey and some of the Pomone's people, looking earnestly southward along the Strand. Stephen joined them, saying, "May I introduce Dr. Jacob, the assistant surgeon of whom I told you?" "Very happy, sir," said Jack, shaking Jacob's hand. He would obviously have said more, but at this moment a strong murmur all along from the bastion increased immensely as two boats left the flagship, pulling for the shore and towing a bare grating with the soaked and wretched prisoners upon it. A few minutes later the grating was cast off. A small surf brought it in, and the men scrambled in the shallows. There was some sparse catcalling from the crowd, but not much, and half a dozen people helped them to dry land, dragging their belongings. "Dr. Jacob," said Jack, "I hope you'll be able to come aboard without delay. I'm eager to be out of sight of this place." And privately to Stephen he said, "I repeated your no penetration, no sodomy, which floored one and all, though I must say that most of them were glad. I persuaded the others to find no more than gross indecency." "And is being towed ashore on a grating the set penalty for gross indecency?" "No. We call it the use and custom of the sea. That's the way it's always been." The squadron, necessarily gathered together in a hurry and necessarily short-handed, had to be thoroughly reorganized, above all the unhappy Pomone. A ship always suffered from a trial for sodomy, and this corporate shame had a thoroughly bad effect on discipline, which had never been the Pomone's strongest point, and a new captain and second lieutenant were unlikely to remedy this state of affairs in the near future. She did have a good boatswain, however, and the gunner was willing and knowledgeable. He and Captain Pomfret were suitably shocked when the Commodore invited them to accompany Surprise out into the strait, so that both ships might exercise the great guns firing at towed targets. The Pomones brought their ship out creditably, and they were reasonably brisk at the dumb show of running the 18-pounders in and out. But the fury of the recoil shocked them extremely, and after the first wavering, ragged broadside, several had to be carried below, hurt by iron-taut tackles and breechings. On the whole, it was a lamentable exhibition, and the Surprises had no compunction in making it even more ludicrous by destroying the unscathed target with 3 broadsides in 5 minutes and 10 seconds. "Captain Pomfret," said Jack before he left the ship, "I can foresee a very great deal of great gun exercise, morning and afternoon, as well as at quarters." "Yes, sir," said Pomfret. "The only thing I can advance is that we are cruelly short-handed, and the people have not been together long." "You have enough right seamen to man your pinnace and launch?" "Yes, sir." "Then let your first lieutenant and the second, when he joins, take them out in the middle watch and lie off Cape Spartel till dawn. If they do not press a score of hands out of the passing merchantmen who have not yet heard the news, I shall be amazed. But keep your people hard at it. Praise if ever you can. You'll find it answer wonderfully. Next week you may fire live. Nothing pleases them more. Once they're used to the din." Returning to harbour and to Surprise's great cabin, in spite of its name not spacious enough for all the administrative work that overflowed the Commodore's desk, Jack cried to Stephen as the doctor walked in from the quarter gallery, "I believe I've solved your problem. I've found you a loblolly boy you'll thoroughly approve of." Stephen made no reply other than a questioning look. He owed his survival as an intelligence agent to an acute ear for falsity, and Jack's last words were certainly untrue. "Yes," Jack went on, "together with a draft of hands out of Leviathan, Maggie Cheel and Paul Skeeping have come aboard, and Paul was trained at Haslar. She's up to anything in the way of blood and horrors." "You are speaking of women? You who've always abominated so much as the smell of a skirt aboard ship? The invariable cause of trouble, quarrelling, ill luck, wholly out of place in any ship, above all in a man-of-war? I've never seen a woman aboard a man-of-war." "Did you never see them helping with the guns and passing shot in Bologna?" "Never in life." "Am I not always shut up in the cockpit during an action?" "Very true, but these are not creatures in the sense of Portsmouth trollops. Oh, no. They're usually middle-aged or more, often the widow of a petty officer. Most have used the sea these 10 or 20 years, and they look like seamen. Only for the skirt, and maybe shawl. And they do keep out of the way. They don't belong to any watch, and they don't appear at quarters, no, nor anywhere else, except when we rig church. A loblolly girl, for all love, I wonder at it, Jack. Come, Stephen, Paul's a kind, cheerful, conscientious soul, but very like a round shot, and not likely to stir the amorous propensities of the sick berth. Will you at least have a word with her? I can answer for her being kind, honest, sober, and tender with the wounded." Paul Skeeping, in a clean apron and cap, walked in, obviously nervous. "Mrs. Skeeping," said Stephen, "I am without a sick berth attendant. The captain has told me that you were conscientious and tender to the wounded. But what of amputation, the use of the trephine?" "Bless you, sir, my father was a butcher, an horse-knacker, and my brothers and me used to play at surgeons in the jointing house. So I'm hardly what could be called squeamish." The introduction of Dr. Jacob to the gunroom went as well as Stephen could have wished. Harding, Summers, and Hewell were hospitable, civilized men, and Dr. Jacob, willing to please and to be pleased, succeeded in both. When Woodbine, the master, hurried in, he found the gunroom in a fine buzz of conversation. He excused his lateness to the president. That sudden gust took Elpino the Greek over the side, and we've been fishing him out. A very strong gust indeed. I've known this foretell a 7-day blow out of the northeast. How do you do, sir, Mr. Jacob? You're very welcome, I'm sure. There did indeed follow strong, steady winds from the northeast, day after day. And during this time Jack rearranged the forces at hand, exercised them at gunnery, and dined regularly with his captains. The wind did not interrupt Stephen's habit of visiting the hospital every morning, and then he turned to music, and one afternoon finished the second part of his suite, a Forlan, copied it fair, and showed it to Jack in the evening. They were interrupted by Salmon, master's mate. "Beg pardon, sir. Ringle's come in." Jack saw that the young man was dripping, and he called for his boat cloak. The unceasing wind had built up a wall of broken water against the towering mole, a wall made even more impenetrable at deck height by the fog-like rain and the disappearance of the sun's faint ghost behind the rock. Ringle's captain came up the frigate's side extraordinarily nimble, with the hook that replaced one of his hands, a packet of letters carried in his bosom. "How in God's name did you get here so quick, William?" cried Jack, shaking his one hand. "I had not looked for you this week. Come below, have a tot of brandy." "Why, sir, you'd not believe our run, this splendid breeze, right off, day after day. But, sir, before I say anything more than all's well at home, I must tell you we saw Pomone's boats being attacked by small craft under the lee of Spartel. We soon dealt with the Moors and offered the boats a tow, but Pomone's first lieutenant said, no, we must carry straight on and tell the flag that there were a half-dozen Sally rovers in La Raiche waiting for the East Indiaman lying to just down the coast. He bade us shove off instantly. There was not a moment to lose. "Very true," said Jack. "Mr. Harding, throw out the signal. Squadron, prepare to unmoor." The squadron had scarcely cleared the straits before the rain stopped and the wind lessened. "Mr. Woodbine," said Jack to the master, "I believe we may send up the topgallant masts and spread a little more canvas." This was pure sailing, with a fine regular heave and lift, an urgency of the water all along the side, the moon and the stars making that even journey across the sky. Jack glanced down the line. All present, and to leeward, Ringle running goose-winged on a parallel course and within hail. "Mr. Hewell, signal squadron diminish lights, reduce sail." Then, leaning over the rail, "Ringle! Sir! Close to speak, Pennant!" "William," said Jack in a conversational tone some minutes later, looking down at the young man who stood there, smiling up, his steel hook gleaming in the foremast ratlins, "be so good as to look into La Raiche, and if you see more than 2 or 3 Xebec-rigged Corsairs and galleys in the harbour, stand offshore and send up 3 blue lights. If less, then red lights, and rejoin without the loss of a moment." "Aye, aye, sir." 8 bells. All round surprised, the sentinels called "All's well" and prepared to go below, but without conviction, they knowing their captain. How right they were. As soon as the muffled thunder of the watch below hurrying up on deck had died away, Jack said loud to the relieving officer, "Mr. Summers, we may pipe to breakfast at 2 bells. Or earlier, and then clear. It's not worth going below." 2 bells. And almost at once 3 red lights appeared, spreading like crimson flowers. La Raiche had no Corsairs. Jack called down, "Pipe to breakfast," and gave orders to increase sail, to steer south by southwest, and prepare for action. The squadron had been sailing close inshore, heading for a point beyond which there rose the modest hill called the Sugarloaf. At the first remote sound of guns, Jack threw out the signal, "Make more sail," and when they came round the point they had the battle spread out before them in the little leeward bay, rosy with a burning ship and lit by innumerable flashes. The East India convoy under sail was being attacked by at least a score of xebecs and galleys, while small craft crammed with Moors waited to board any disabled merchantman. The convoy, escorted only by a 16-gun brig sloop, had formed into a line, but it was almost helpless against the galleys, which could race downwind of the line under sail, turn, take to their oars, and come up from leeward, raking the hindmost ships from right aft, where their guns could do terrible slaughter, while the galley itself could not be touched by its victim's cannon. Jack made the signal for independent engagement, and launched the surprise at what seemed to be the commanding xebec. When each was 5 points on the other's bow, Jack backed his foretopsail and called, "On the downward roll! Fire from forward as they bear!" All along the deck the gun crews crouched motionless, each gun captain glaring along the barrel. Some musket fire, 2 or 3 well-directed round shot from the xebec. The tingling sound of a gun hit full on the barrel, and the Surprise fired a long, rippling broadside from 40 yards. The wind blew the smoke back, blinding them, and when it cleared they saw a most shocking wreckage. Half the xebec's ports beaten in, and her rudder shot away. They also heard Jack's roaring, "Look alive there! Run 'em out!" his order to fill the topsail, and the cry, "Port your helm!" He took the Surprise right under the xebec's stern. The frigate stayed beautifully and ran up the enemy's side. The next broadside shattered the Moor entirely. She began to settle at once, her people flinging everything that would float over the side. The rest of the squadron was engaged, the bay resounding with the bellowing of guns, but already the issue was decided. Those xebecs that could spread their huge lateens on either side and raced away close on 15 knots, while the uninjured galleys pulled straight into the wind's eye, where no sailing ship could follow them. When they had buried their dead and repaired the worst of their damage, they parted on the best of terms, the Indiaman steering northwest, with Dover to escort them home, and the squadron beating up, tack upon tack, for Gibraltar. Stephen had some seriously injured patients, but was not desperately busy, and he was able to accept Jack's invitation to dine with several of the captains. He was placed between Hugh Pomfret and Mr. Woodbine, the master, who was eagerly engaged in an argument with Captain Cartwright of Ganymede about lunar observations. Captain Pomfret, though obviously in very low spirits, provided a proper amount of conversation. Yet it did not surprise Stephen when, as the party broke up, Pomfret asked in a low voice whether he might beg for a consultation, a wholly personal, confidential matter. "Certainly," said Stephen. "Let us take a turn upon deck." "Mahon," said Pomfret under the open sky, "under my orders, beat 1 Moorish galley to pieces by gunfire and deliberately rowed down 2 others in the melee, cutting them in half so they sank within the minute. And I perpetually see those scores of men, Christian slaves, chained to their oars, looking up in horror, looking up for mercy. And I sailed on to destroy another. Is it right? Can it be right? I cannot sleep for those faces gazing up, straining up. Have I mistaken my profession?" "I feel extremely for your very great distress," said Stephen. "I do not think you have. But, no, I should have to summon more powers than I can call upon at present to justify even a war against a dictatorial system, a denial of freedom. And I shall only say that I feel it must be fought. And since it has to be fought, it is better that it should be fought with what humanity war does allow, and by officers of your kind. I shall send you a box of pills that will give you 2 nights' heavy sleep. If, having slept, you wish to hear my reasons, I hope I shall have them fairly well arranged. And after that, you must be your own physician." That night the wind backed steadily until by 2 bells in the graveyard watch it steadied, strengthened, and carried them right through the strait, a sweet passage to the rock itself. Stephen and Jacob were heartily glad of it, because 3 of their badly injured men had taken a serious turn for the worse. In one case a leg could no longer be saved. and all but the slightly wounded men were taken to the hospital. They had finished, had taken off their bloody aprons, and were washing their hands when a grave midshipman arrived from the Commodore, desiring them to come aboard at once. It was a quiet, serious, hurried boat that carried them out. But Stephen did notice the blue peter at Surprise's masthead, and the bedraggled appearance of the Mahon, with yards all uneven and sails drooping in the breeze. He'd never seen a man-of-war look so desolate. As they approached the pennant ship, they saw a captain's barge at the starboard gangway, and so pulled round to the other side. By the time Stephen reached the deck, the barge was shoving off. "There you are, Doctor," said Jack. "Come and take a draught. There's been a shocking accident aboard Mahon. Poor Hugh Pomfret was cleaning his pistols, and by some wretched mischance one was loaded. It blew his brains out. The Admiral is deeply concerned, but he has orders to send the squadron to sea immediately. He has a young man of his own at hand, John Vaux, who distinguished himself at the taking of the Diamond Rock in the year 4. His barge will carry Pomfret's body to the cemetery, but our orders are so urgent that the Admiral will take care of the funeral. As soon as the barge is back, we proceed to Mahon." By the time the squadron had sunk the land, the full topsail gale was so steady from the west-northwest that the Surprise was making 10 knots and more, never touching a sheet or brace. And after retreat, the smoking circle formed in the galley, the only place where smoking was allowed. "This is an unlucky squadron, if ever there was one. Wicked self-murder in Mahon. How can there be any luck in such a commission? Gammon!" cried Killick. "If it had been self-murder, he would have been buried at the crossroads. No, mate, he was buried in a Christian grave, the Admiral in attendance. So be damned to your bad luck, Joshua Simmons." Simmons gave a bitter sniff. "In any case," Killick went on, "we have a gent aboard that brings in luck by wholesale. He has a unicorn's horn in his cabin. Whole and entire, a unicorn's horn as is proof against all poisons. As some people know very well," glancing at Poll, who nodded in a very knowledgeable manner, "and which is worth 10 times its own weight in Guinea gold. And not only that, mates, he likewise has a hand of glory. There's luck for you." A shocked silence. "What's a hand of glory?" asked a nervous voice. "Why, it's one of the hangman's prime perquisites. There's the rope, of course. He can get half a crown an inch for a rope that hanged a right villain. But most of all, it's the hand of glory that makes the hangman so eager for the work. Because why? Because it, too, is worth its weight in silver for the luck it brings, which it is the hand that did the deed. Ripped the young girl up, or slit the old gentleman's throat, and that the hangman cuts off, and our doctor has one in a jar which he keeps secret in the cabin and looks at by night with his mate, talking very low." There were some dull sailors in Jack Aubrey's squadron, and it was not until Tuesday afternoon that they rounded Eyre Island. The Commodore knew Port Mahon intimately, and he took the lead as they glided down the long inlet. "How little it has changed," he said with pleasure. They moored just under the steep pitched town, and a cable's length from the wharf where the pigtail steps ran down from the main square. As Jack's barge was lowered, the warm breeze brought the scent of blossom from the orange groves. Admiral Fanshawe received them very kindly, but very soon his secretary said, "Sir, I should take Dr. Maturin to see Mr. Colvin." Colvin was a man with whom Stephen had often had dealings in London. "We have made a beginning with the Adriatic yards," he said to Stephen as the Admiral's secretary left them. "From Ancona and Bari, our banking friend has not only called in the loans made to the small shipwrights concerned with French vessels, but he's also warned all suppliers to insist on cash. No notes of hand, no promises. Mr. D knows perfectly well that these small yards have almost no capital of their own, and that when payday comes round and there is no pay, the workmen are likely to turn ugly. These places rely for a large part on itinerant skilled labour, most of it Italian. Now, I do not know, sir, whether you have any moral scruples about having dealings with the Carbonari or even Freemasons? Both Colvin and Stephen were Catholics, and in childhood had been assured by those they loved and respected that whenever Freemasons held a formal gathering, one of their number was invariably the devil himself. As for the Carbonari, Stephen replied, Lord William had no hesitation about treating with them in Sicily. In these parts they are said to be strangely allied to the Freemasons. Some of their rites are similar. Stephen shook his head. A scruple would have to be very moral indeed for me to reject any means of bringing this vile war to an end. I take it that you feel these people might be useful to us? Indeed they may. Many of the Italian craftsmen in the yards are Carbonari. At the same time, our friends in Ancona and Bari have great influence with their fellow masons in the Adriatic ports, and will prevent them from relieving the shipwrights. Well, sir, said Jack Aubrey to Admiral Fanshawe, looking up from his notes and counting the slips that would enable the officers in charge of the base to revictual and refit the squadron, that sets us up very handsomely. Many, many thanks. And now, sir, if I may, I'll beg leave to retire. I have an appointment with my surgeon at the Crown. He's not ordinarily an irascible creature, but I know that today he is with child to call upon your engineer. James Wright, that prodigy of learning. I would give a £5 note to see them together. Jack and Stephen met almost on the very steps of the Crown Inn. "Well met, brother," cried Jack. Stephen considered the Commodore's face and his gait. Was he sober? "You look uncommon cheerful, my dear," he said. "I wish you may not have met with some compliant young person overwhelmed with all the gold lace upon your person." "Never in life," said Jack. "Aubrey the Chaste is what I'm called throughout the service." They walked down to the waiting boat, Stephen looking thoughtful. "Jack, I fear I've been so indiscreet as to ask Mr. Wright to dine aboard without consulting you. I particularly wish him to see the narwhal horn, and to hear his view on the large number of parallel spirals ascending it." "I should very much like to hear him, no man more," said Jack. "We could invite Jacob, too, and have some music. I know that Mr. Wright delights in a fugue." The frigate's dinner for Mr. Wright was surprisingly successful. The captain's cook had put himself out, and they ate nobly. But what particularly pleased Stephen was the way in which the great engineer took to Jack Aubrey, and even more to Jacob. They had a lively discussion on the local varieties of modern Greek, and the curious versions of Turkish that had come into being among the subject nations of the immense Turkish Empire. "I was a fair hand with Homer at school," said Wright, "but when I was desired to build the wharves and breakwater at Hyla, I found that my Greek was no good at all, and I was obliged to employ a dragoman. No doubt you, sir, were better prepared for the Eastern Mediterranean." "Why, sir," said Jacob, "it was not so much prescience on my part as the pure good fortune of having spent my tender years, the years when a language flows into your mind with no intellectual effort, among Turks, Greeks, and people speaking many varieties of Arabic and Berber, as well as the archaic Hebrew of the Beni Mzab, Jews. My people were jewel merchants, based mostly in the Levant, but travelling very widely indeed." "Surely, doctor," said Jack, "it must be a perilous business, rambling about mountains and deserts with a parcel of jewels in your pocket. There are likely to be bandits, are there not? For my part, I should never dare wander about a desert carrying a stock of gemstones without a troop of horse at my back." A midshipman came in to Commodore Aubrey's side, and conveyed Mr. Harding's duty, together with the news that the officer commanding the convoy destined for London desired leave to part company. "Forgive me, gentlemen," said Jack, rising. "I shall not be long." Long he was not, but already the talk had flowed on, and Jacob was repeating the word "mzab," with some emphasis to Mr. Wright, who leant forward, one hand cupping his ear. "Forgive me, sir," said Jacob. "I was just explaining how generations of nomadic jewel trading teaches one to survive. The network of trusted associates often related, the custom of travelling in small family groups, middle-aged women, young children, few guards and those few at a distance, a modest drove of indifferent horses or camels as ostensible property. I particularly stress the young and preferably dirty, shabby children. They do away with any idea of wealth, and I did so partly to explain to Dr. Maturin how I came to be acquainted with the Zanata dialect of Berber and the archaic Hebrew of Mzab." "An acquaintance I envy you," said Jack. Jacob bowed. "I'd been taken along by some Alexandrian cousins, playing the part of unwashed children to perfection, but when we came to their usual resting place among the Beni Mzab, a camel gave me so severe a bite they were obliged to leave me and a great-aunt and travel on to an important rendezvous. It was there that I learnt the double guttural of the Beni Mzab Hebrew, and that I became thoroughly at home with the trilateral roots of the Berber." He gave a good many examples of the Hebrew in question, and of Berber grammar, illustrating them with quotations from Ibn Khaldun. "By your leave, sir," cried Killick, to Jack's relief, for he was afraid that Mr. Wright's interest in archaic Hebrew was waning fast. His interest in Spotted Dick, however, was as eager as Jack's, in spite of his age, and after a while he said in a voice of real authority, "The French may say what they please, but it seems to me that civilization reaches its very height in the glistening, gently mottled form of just such a pudding as this, bedewed with its unctuous sauce." "How wholly I agree with you, sir," cried Jack. "Allow me to cut you a slice from the translucent starboard end." "Well, if I must, I must," said Mr. Wright, eagerly advancing his plate. Gradually the pudding diminished, the decanters made their stately round, and Jack Aubrey brought up the subject of music. "Until a little while ago," he observed, "I'd never heard of a Bohemian composer called Zelenka. Then I was given a copy of his Richer Car for 3 voices, which I thought we might offer you with your coffee. Unless, indeed, you'd prefer the Locatelli C major trio?" "To tell you the truth, dear Commodore, I should prefer the Locatelli. There is something truly dispassionate and, as it were, geometrical in the trio that touches me. But before that, may I beg Dr. Maturin to show me his horn?" Jack Aubrey had spoken of coffee, but at present all hands were still drinking Madeira, most emphatically all hands, since Killick, his mate, and the boy third class, who helped him in the background, were very fond of this ancient wine, and had perfected a way of substituting a full for a half-empty decanter at the end of each passing, which the 3 then drained as opportunity offered. Stephen had been aware of their motions for some while. He had little to say about it on moral grounds, but it appeared to him that the third-class boy was very near his limit. It was therefore something of a relief to Stephen when the last decanter was removed. "Killick," he said, "pray be so good as to step into my cabin and bring the bow case hanging behind the door." "Aye, aye, sir," cried Killick, paler than Stephen could have wished. "Bow case it is." But bow case it was not. Killick had seen fit to take the horn out, and now he could be seen for a moment in the open door of the coach making antic gestures with it at the third-class boy, who was draining the last of the wine. cried the boy, choking, and he plunged forward in a paroxysm of adolescent drunkenness, spewing improbable jets of Madeira, grasping Killick's knees and bringing him down. He fell flat on the deck, and the horn broke in the middle with a sharp crack, sending off a long sliver that shot into the great cabin. Jack strode forward over the two bodies, calling very loud and clear for his boatswain, swabbers, and the master-at-arms. Bondon took in the situation at once, and in a cold, silent fury he ran the now speechless Killick away forward, while the master-at-arms dragged the wretched boy to the nearest pump. The swabbers set to without a word, and with extraordinary speed the frigate's people cleaned up, cleared away, and restored the cabin to a wholly civilized condition. Mr. Wright was sitting on the broad locker by the sweep of stern windows when Stephen came back, carrying his cello and scores. The old gentleman had the pieces of narwhal horn carefully arranged by his side, the broken parts set together, and the 18-inch splinter laid so exactly in place that the horn looked whole. "You're Dr. Maturin," he said. "I fear you must be grievously distressed." "No, sir," said Stephen, "I do not mind it." Wright hesitated for a moment and then went on. "Believe me, this is one of the few things I can do really well. The providential splinter has shown me the nature of the inner substance. The breaks are perfectly clean, and I have a cement that will knit them so firmly that the tooth will retain all its original strength. Pray let me take it home with me, will you?" "I should be infinitely obliged to you, sir." "And while you're playing, I shall muse with the other half of my mind on the lower shaft in which these whirls and spirals are so startlingly obvious. A very extraordinary puzzle indeed." Once again the thunder roared from the saluting batteries as Jack Aubrey's squadron made its painful and dangerous way out of Mahon harbour. A small squadron now, since Briseis, Rainbow, and Ganymede had been sent off to protect the eastern trade, and Dover was still escorting the Indiamen on their homeward run. Ringle, leading the way, was nimble and brisk in stays, as became a schooner of her class. So was Surprise, handled by a man who'd sailed her for the finest part of his life at sea, a ship, furthermore, that was blessed with an uncommonly high proportion of truly able seamen. Not that theirs was a happy lot as the channel grew even narrower, the cries of "Hands about ship!" more frequent, and the recently shipped marines, at least one in each gun crew, more awkward still. For in common decency the battery's salutes to the broad pennant had to be returned exactly, and this called for wonderful activity. Yet the sufferings of the Surprises were not to be compared to those of the Pomones, a huddled-together ship's company with a captain who'd never commanded a post-ship before, a disgruntled first lieutenant, and a new second lieutenant who did not know a single man aboard, and whose orders were often confused, misunderstood, and sometimes shouted down by exasperated, frightened boatswain's mates, far too busy with their starters. And all this in an unhandy, heavily pitching frigate, with far too much sail set forward. The Commodore and his officers watched from the quarter-deck. Often and often their heads shook with the same grave foreboding. "Blundering, hopeless, grass-combing buggers for all love," murmured Jack as the Pomone's jib-boom brushed the pitiless rock. Unlikely though it seemed, even the Cala de San Esteban had an end. First Ringle cleared the point and was followed by all the others. Yet although, against probability, he had escaped shipwreck, young Captain Vaux did not, like some of his shipmates, give way to relief. "Silence, fore and aft!" he cried in a voice worthy the service, and in the shocked hush, "Mr. Bates, make the signal, permission to fire a few rounds." The signal had barely broken out aloft before the reply came, "As many as you can afford." Captain Vaux was of a wealthy, open-handed family, and he wanted his ship to be a fighting machine as efficient as the Surprise, and if a few hundredweight of powder would advance her in that direction, he was perfectly willing to pay for them. A few minutes after the Commodore's signal, therefore, the gunfire began again, fairly regular broadsides that surrounded the frigate with a fine cloud of smoke, broadsides that grew perceptibly more regular as time went on. The stabbing flame and the heart-shaking din of a great gun exercise of this kind nearly always spread cheerfulness and high spirits. Yet although Pomone's cannon roared prodigiously, there was precious little joy aboard her neighbour, the Surprise. Even after dinner, 2 pounds of fresh Minorcan beef ahead, and grog, and even after supper, the general gloom persisted. Killick's misfortune was known to the last detail, and the dreadful fall, the shattering of the precious horn. It was much the same the next day, and the next. No joy among the people of Surprise, for the Luck had gone out of the ship, together with the broken horn. No joy. Even the smoking circle in the galley was not a very jovial, lively place at present. There they were, the 2 doctors, stamping in horrid passion and uttering words like a pair of mad lions. At this point in Paul's keeping's account, Killick came in with an improbable pile of shirts in his arms. He'd been washing, ironing, polishing the great cabin silver to an unearthly brilliance in the hope of forgiveness. But from the great cabin to the galley he was still looked upon with a sour, disappointed dislike. But even in a pitch of distress that had cut his appetite, his pleasure in tobacco, and his sleep, his intense curiosity lingered on, and now he asked why the doctors were swearing so. "Well, Killick," said Paul Skeeping, "I am surprised you should not know, being it was your so-called hand of glory that was to make us all so rich." "Oh, no," whispered Killick. "Oh, yes," cried Paul, tossing her head. "As you know very well, the doctors kept in a jar of double-refined spirits of wine so that it should stay fresh. And what happened? Some goddamn villain had been drawing off the spirit and replacing it with water. So now it's just bloody water and damn all else, while the hand has grown gamey-like. It's all up with the finer tissues. But at least they put it out to dry, and they hope to draw the tendons and wire the bones together tomorrow evening." Alas for their hopes! When the medical men approached the table where the poor hand had been left to dry, they found nothing but a very faint bloody trace and the print of a dog's right forefoot. It was the officer in command of the Surprise's Royal Marines, Captain Hobden, that had a long-legged yellow dog, Naseby. He was a friendly young creature, used to shipboard life and scrupulously clean, though given to theft. "Your beautiful present deep enough maw of that vile mongrel. All our work wasted," cried the doctors, and they cursed the dog with extreme violence in Berber and Gaelic. Stephen found Hobden in the gunroom. "Sir," he said, pale with anger, "I must have your dog. He has stolen my preserved hand, and I must either open him or exhibit a powerful emetic before it is too late." "How'd you know it was my dog? They're all the ship's cats, thieves to a man. Come with me to the galley, and I will show you." Naseby was indeed in the galley. Stephen seized the dog, raised his scarred forepaw, showed it to Hobden, and said, "There's your proof. I must give him a very strong emetic, and if that does not work, then it must be the knife." "It was your own fault for leaving it about," cried Hobden. "You shall not touch my dog, you pragmatical bastard." "Will you stand by those words, sir?" asked Stephen, his head cocked to one side. "Until my dying day," said Hobden, rather too loud. Stephen left the room smiling. He found Summers, the second lieutenant, on the forecastle. "Mr. Summers," he said, "I beg pardon for interrupting you, but I have had a disagreement with Captain Hobden, who used a blackguardly insult made in public, in the galley itself, for God's sake. May I beg you to be my second?" "Of course, my dear Maturin. I shall wait upon him at once." "Come in," cried Jack Aubrey, looking up. "I beg pardon for interrupting you, sir," said Harding, the frigate's first lieutenant, "but I have some awkward, pressing things to tell you. Dr. Maturin has challenged Hobden, Hobden's dog having eaten a preserved hand, and Hobden, having been told that the hand must be recovered, gave Maturin the lie. I tell you this because the people are very much upset. I do not have to tell you, sir, that seamen are as superstitious as a parcel of old women. They looked upon the horn, sir, as the surest possible guarantee of luck, and next to the horn, or even before it, this hand of glory. You know about it, sir? Of course I do. Thank you for telling me all this, Harding. Now, pray be so good as to tell Hobden that I wish to see him at once. He'll waste no time with uniform. A minute later he called, "Come in!" again, and a shirt-sleeve Hobden appeared. "Captain Hobden," said Jack in a tone of the deepest displeasure, "you must either withdraw the insult to Dr. Maturin and let him retrieve the hand as best he may, or you must leave this ship at Malta. I cannot give you more than 5 minutes to reflect, dogs' powers of digestion being what they are, but while you're reflecting, remember this. In the heat of the moment any man may blurt out a blackguardly expression. Yet after a while, any man worth a groat knows he must unsay it." "There is little hope," said Stephen, considering the dose he'd slid down Naisby's unresisting throat. "At this late hour. Hold the bucket and belay there. Stand back." Sick as a dog he was, but indeed it was too late. "Here at least we have virtually all the bones," said Stephen, stirring with a pair of retractors, "and once they're boiled clean we can wire them together. The hand will be even more emphatically hand-like, and that'll comfort the crew. Paul there, be so good as to call for a couple of swabbers, and I'll take this poor fellow back to his master." The very convincing wiring together did indeed comfort the crew. They waited in files to see the dead white fingers rising tall from the neat pattern of carpal bones set in black gleaming pitch, the whole enclosed in a stern lantern glass. And it was universally agreed that a more glorious hand did not exist. No one was foolish enough to mention luck, but the surprises wore a deeply satisfied look that said much more than any open exultation. Scarcely had hammocks been piped up at 6 bells, this being a Sunday morning, than something like a battle broke out, starting with deep-voiced cannon no great way off. Yet there was no interruption in the steady swabbing of the decks overhead, no excited cries, and as the surprise began to fire, Stephen's mind arose, still bemused from a dream, and he realized that this was not an engagement but the return to a salute. "There you are, Doctor," cried Jack as Stephen came on deck. "A very good morning to you. Here's a glorious sight." Blinking in the glare of the sun, Stephen followed his pointing hand, and there rode a fine, proud frigate, together with a smaller, shabbier corvette. Both were wearing the Bourbon ensign, and halfway between the French ships and Surprise, a captain's barge was rowing with an even stroke. "There he is in his barge, coming across to breakfast. Do not you recognize him, Stephen?" Clear in the early sun was the happy, familiar face of Captain Christy Palliere, their captor, a little before the Algeciras action in 1801, and then their host in Toulon during the brief peace that followed. "How happy I am to see him!" Stephen cried. "Yes, he declared for the king at once, and so did all his officers. They'd almost finished refitting in a little yard south of Castelnuovo. He'd meant to head straight for Malta where he had friends, but the wind would not serve, so he came by Messina." Already the Marines were forming on the quarter-deck. The French barge hooked on, the side boys ran down with their padded man-ropes, and the moment the captain set foot upon the steps, the boatswain piped him aboard in style. "Captain Christy Palliere," cried Jack, taking him most affectionately by the hand. "How very happy I am to see you here, and looking so uncommon well. I do not have to introduce Dr. Maturin, I'm sure. Never in life," said Christy Palliere in his perfect English. "Dear Doctor, how do you do?" They two shook hands, and Jack went on. "But you will allow me to present my first lieutenant, Mr. Harding. Mr. Harding, this is Captain Christy Palliere of His Most Christian Majesty's frigate, Caroline." "Very happy, sir," said each, bowing, and Jack led his guest below. "First, Commodore," said Christy Pallier, taking his seat at the breakfast table, "let me congratulate you on your broad pennant. I've never saluted one with half so much pleasure in all my life." "How kind you are to say so, and may I say how very agreeable it is to have you sitting here as a friend and an ally. Admiral Fanshawe in Mahon will greet you with open arms. Might I beg you to give me an introduction?" "Of course. May I help you to another sausage?" "Oh, if you please. I have not smelt this divine combination of toast, bacon, sausage, and coffee since last I was with my cousins in Laura Place." They talked about the cousins and about Bath for a few moments, and then settled to really serious eating. Eventually they reached toast, marmalade, and a third pot of coffee, and Jack Aubrey said, "My orders take me to the Adriatic for the purpose of strengthening royalists and of capturing or destroying Bonapartist ships. Would it be indiscreet to ask you where there are shipyards that would concern me?" "It would not be in the least indiscreet, my dear Aubrey," said Christy Pallier, "and I will freely tell you all I know, but the situation there is so extremely complicated that I should have to collect my wits. I think I could best give you a notion of things as they were when I left Castelnuova if I were to be looking at your charts." It was clear to Stephen that Christy Pallier felt that matters to do with intelligence were no proper subject for general conversation. He agreed most heartily, and presently he excused himself. "How I wish you'd been with us," Stephen Jack said, as they sat by the stern windows watching the French ship haul her wind and head for Mahon. "It would never have done." "No, I suppose not." Jack Aubrey now looked worn. "But if only someone could have taken notes. He's a dear fellow and a capital seaman, but he does tend to ramble. And in any case it is, as he often said, a complicated situation in the Adriatic, divided loyalties. Some good men on either side, but more waiting to see which way the cat jumps. He said it would be easier to explain the situation if we were standing at the chart table. Shall we do the same, by all means? Well, here is Castelnuovo on the northern tip of the Bocche di Cataro. Caroline's being repaired and refitted in a yard just round the headland. Inside the bay there were 2 brigs of war, not far from completion. Now up to Ragusa Vecchio, and there is a 32-gun frigate almost ready for sea. She's commanded by a fervent Bonapartist, Charles de l'Artois. A pretty good seaman and not at all shy. Several creditable actions. His ship, which according to rumour is paid for in part by a group of Algerines, is moored up against the ruined castle. Now, moving northwards up the islands, there are at least half a dozen small yards building cutters, xebecs, and brigs, obviously intended for privateering. Yet recently work has almost stopped for want of funds and material. But at Spalato, there lies the Cerber, pretty well ready for sea, whose commander would be perfectly willing to surrender to Louis XVIII's allies if they appeared in face-saving force. On the other hand, Christie was really anxious about the number of people who were sitting on the fence and the amount of damage they could do if things looked just a little better for Bonaparte. He paused. He was even more concerned with some kind of a plot that he'd heard of at second hand. Yet imperfect though it was, the account impressed him very deeply. It appears that the Mussulmans are preparing to send mercenaries north to prevent the junction of the Austrian and Russian armies, giving Napoleon time to bring up his reserves from the southeast. He felt that there was an extreme urgency. That is why he put to sea. "I'm sure he's right," said Stephen. "So is the Admiralty. That's why we're here. I think you know that Jacob, my assistant, was assigned to me by Sir Joseph. What I should like you to do is to put him aboard the Ringle, and desire William Reed to carry him with all possible speed to Cutali. We have true friends in that fine city. To learn all that he may, and then return with the same extreme rapidity." They rounded Cape Santa Maria at dawn, the sun rising over the Montenegrin heights. This eastern shore was familiar to Jack and Stephen, and they drew in with the land, a fine topgallant breeze on the larboard quarter, and presently the sea grew more and more populated with feluccas, trabaculos, and merchantmen making for the Bocchi di Cataro or emerging from the splendid harbour. "Mr. Harding's duty, sir," said a midshipman, "and the cutter is alongside." Jack followed him, and looking down at the squalor, he said, "Well done, Mr. Ewell. I do not think anyone would connect the boat with the Royal Navy." "I hope not, sir," said Ewell, surveying the filth and tawdry ornament fore and aft, the knotted rigging, and the crew of flashily undressed criminal lunatics. "I did not like to come aboard in quite this shape." "The gunroom might have blushed at quite so much rouge," said Jack. "Well, shove off now, Mr. Ewell, if you please. Fortunately, the breeze is veering, and I do not think you'll have to pull back." Nor did they. The cutter was seen coming round the point at dawn, close-hauled and making a good 5 knots. Her crew had spent much of their time cleaning the boat and themselves, and Ewell did not hesitate in coming aboard, nor indeed in breakfasting with the Commodore and his surgeon. When Captain Vaux came aboard in response to a signal, he found the great cabin still comfortably scented with bacon and coffee. "Good morning, Vaux," said the Commodore, offering him a chair. "Mr. Ewell has just given me his report on Vecchia, where that Bonapartist frigate is lying. She's moored by the Mole in front of the old castle, and there are 2 Algerian polecas with her, mounting a score of guns between them, 9-pounders. There's also the question of shore batteries, 1 at each end of the Mole, and 6 emplacements in each. Come and look at the chart. Here we are." Mr. Ewell could not be seen to be too busy with his glass, so he cannot tell what guns they mounted, but even 9-pounders intelligently fired could annoy us in our approach. "You have your full complement of Marines, I believe?" "Yes, sir, under a very capable officer, Lieutenant Turnbull." "Well, that makes 65 between us. It occurs to me that if we land them here—" Aubrey pointed to a small bay just south of Vecchia. "They can cross the slight rise to the next beach and take the batteries from behind. The Mole will protect them from the frigate's guns once they reach it." Within 5 minutes of landing their marines, the Surprise and Pomone had stood on past the northern tip of the bay and brought Vecchio into view, a decayed straggling village north of the ruined castle, and at the bottom of the bay, the frigate in question with the 2 Algerian vessels. Boats passing to and fro over the smooth water. The fine topgallant breeze still at south-southwest. Jack ordered colours to be hoisted and said to the master, "Mr. Woodbine, lay me 25 yards from her larboard bow, and then back topsails. Doctor, be so good as to stand by to translate." There was great activity aboard the French frigate, and they seemed to be casting off their moorings. The Polacca had already won her single anchor, and her companion was slipping her cable. The Surprise sailed between them and the Frenchman, back 2 of her topsails, and lay there rocking gently. The scent of slow match eddied along the deck. Jack hailed the Frenchman. "What ship is that?" his words echoed by Stephen Maturin. A remarkably handsome young man on the quarter-deck, post-captain's uniform and cocked hat, which he raised, replied, "Ardent, of the Imperial Navy." At this there was a universal and singularly impressive cry of "Vive l'Empereur!" from the Ardent's company. "My dear sir," Jack went on, returning the salute, "France is now ruled by His Most Christian Majesty Louis XVIII, by my master's ally. I must ask you to hoist the appropriate colours and accompany me to Mahon." "It grieves me to disappoint you, sir," said the Ardent's captain, now very pale with anger, "but it would be contrary to my duty." "It grieves me to insist, but if you do not comply, we shall be obliged to use force." During this time the Algerians had been making short boards, They now lay on the Surprise's larboard bow and quarter, and our people were shrieking orders or advice. "Port lids, both sides!" called Jack. The red-painted lids all flew up as one, while 2 seconds later the guns ran out with a deep, echoing thump. The same happened aboard the Frenchman. "Messieurs les Anglais!" called the Ardent's captain. "Tirez les premiers!" Who in fact fired the first shot was never decided, for both sides went to it as fast as ever they could, a most enormous, shattering din that covered the immediate shore with a dense cloud of white smoke shot through and through with stabbing orange jets of flame. At first Surprise's fire was rather slow. She had not enough hands to fight both sides at once, but very soon the slight-built Algerines found they could not bear the weight of her shot and retreated out of range. And at first the roar of gunfire on the Ardent side had been much increased by the shore batteries firing 18-pounders, but even in the tumult of battle the Surprises caught the rapid decline. And scarcely had the Marines silenced the last of the battery's guns than 3 well-directed shot, fired from Surprise's aftermost guns on the downward rolled, pierced the Ardent's side, striking her light room. There was a small explosion, the beginning of a fire, and then some seconds later a second explosion, enormously greater. A vast column of smoke and flame shot into the sky, darkening the sun. The aftermost third of the frigate was wholly shattered. The wreckage sank directly, and the rest followed in a slow, hideous lurch, settling on the bottom with only her foretopmast showing. Yet even before she'd settled, the sea was torn and lashed by falling debris, her whole main-top with several feet of the mast, many great spars, countless blocks, and unrecognizable great smouldering lumps of timber, trailing smoke. "Avast firing!" cried Jack in the deafened silence that followed. "Mr. Harding, lower the boats and bid Mahon come within hail." He ran below where Stephen was just straightening, after having splintered a torn and broken arm that Paul was expertly bandaging. "The doctor will soon put you right, Edwards," Jack said to the patient, and drawing Stephen aside, he asked him privately how urgent he thought their mission to Spalato. "Of the very first urgency," said Stephen. Jack nodded. "Very well," said he. "What is our damage?" "Harris shot dead, 6 splinter wounds, 1 dangerous, and 2 men hurt by falling blocks. A very modest butcher's bill." Jack said a word to each of the men and returned to the deck. Mahon had already come abreast. "Captain Vaux," Jack called, "have you suffered much?" "Very little, sir, for such a brisk turn to." "Then pray pick up what survivors you can, recover our marines, and follow me to Spalato without the loss of a minute." Surprise's voyage to Spalato was rendered tedious by capricious winds and by the hazardous nature of the Dalmatian coast, with its many islands, not to say vile reefs. Its end, beyond the point of Lesina, was through a narrow passage between the land and the island of Brazza, very dark and very narrow. And there was Spalato right before them, the setting sun casting a wonderfully moving glory on the enormous rectangle of Diocletian's palace. And before Surprise was wholly clear of the channel, the immense voice of the lookout at the foremast head called, "On deck there! Ringle fine on the starboard bow!" Jack instantly gave a series of orders. Before she reached the open water, the frigate was under bare poles, riding to a kedge in the gentle outward current. By the time Ringle was alongside and Reed aboard Surprise with Dr. Jacob, darkness had fallen and fireflies could be seen drifting across the strait. Jack took them both below, but Jacob was bleeding so profusely from a wound that he'd contrived to inflict upon himself as he came up the side, probably on a shattered length of the gunwale, that Stephen had to lead him away to sew up the gash. "Stephen, your friends in Kutali received me nobly and told me a great deal. 5 of the Brotherhood's most considerable members are riding by the Pasha's relays to Durazzo, and there they will take one of Selim's fast-sailing huarios for Algiers. They are to beg the Dey to transport the money promised by the Sheikh. It may be possible to intercept them between Pantelleria and Kelibia. Jack opened the door of the sick bay and looked in. "Forgive me for interrupting," he said. "I just wanted to ask Dr. Jacob where the French frigate is lying." "Over by the Marsha, sir, the broad northern end." "How many guns does she carry?" "I'm sorry to say that I never noticed, sir, but so many, according to his secretary, that he could not decently surrender to a little 9-pounder frigate." "I see," said Jack. "Thank you, Doctor." "I'm afraid I offended him," said Jacob when the door had closed. "Never in life, colleague," said Stephen. "Pray go on." But Jacob had been so shaken by Jack's cold look that it took him some moments to collect his ideas. "Yes," he said. "Well, I sent word to our friend in Ancona and to arrange a meeting with the heads of the Carbonari as soon as you should appear. Hope this does not embarrass you." "Not in the least. Has a time been named?" "Just after the rising of the moon." "Commodore dear," Stephen said some moments later, "would you know when the moon rises tonight?" "At 33 minutes after midnight. And, Stephen, let me tell you something. Mahon is arrived. If I were acting for myself, I should send a French-speaking officer aboard the French frigate to tell her captain that Mahon, a 30-gun 18-pounder frigate, and the 12-pounder Surprise would enter the harbour at first light tomorrow, that they would fire half a dozen blank broadsides at close range, to which he would respond also with blanks, and that then, decencies preserved, we should all make sail, leaving by the broad northwest passage, and proceed to Malta. But would this interfere with your plans?" "Not in the least. And if you wish, I will carry your proposal to the Cerbère." "Mr. Woodbine," said Jack to the master at 6 bells in the middle watch, "you can make out the Frenchman's lights, I believe." "Yes, sir." "Then run up her larboard side within 50 yards. He walked aft and called over the dark water, "Mahon, I'm about to get under way." Within moments Surprise had steerage way, and the water spoke down her side as gently as the breeze in the rigging. Out of the shelter of Brazza, under the faint blur of the moon behind high cloud, and she began to roll just a little. Mr. Woodbine kept his eyes fixed on the Cerbère's lit stern. It grew larger, brighter. "Round to," he said to the man at the wheel. Then, as Surprise's turn led her parallel to the Cerbère, and her bows came level with the Frenchman's quarter, the master backed the main topsail, taking the way off her, and Jack cried, "Fire!" Instantly the ship's side shot forth an enormous volume of sound, and an immense smoke bank lit with brilliant flashes, smoke that drifted over the Cerbère, which replied through it with an even greater roar. Stephen Maturin, worn limp after countless hours of negotiation, mostly in Slavonic languages that had to be translated, with people playing shawms outside to prevent the possibility of eavesdropping, had lain flat on his cot the moment he reached it, plunging instantly into a stupor rather than a Christian sleep. From this his body leapt up at the first prodigious crash, leaving its wits behind it, and when the two came together he found that he was sitting by the door, his body as tense as a frightened cat's. He groped his way on deck. He arrived for the Frenchman's next reply. Above the smoke the whole low arch of the sky was brilliantly lit. Algerine merchantmen could be seen frantically making sail, innumerable lights on shore running about, the whole city clear in a momentary blaze of light. Surprise drew ahead, and now it was Mahon's turn, her 18-pounders making an even more shocking din. "Well, Doctor," said the Commodore, "I'm afraid you had but a short nap of it. But we shall soon have done. Mr. Woodbine, I believe we may go about." Yet another tack, yet another apocalyptic series of shattering broadsides, renewed screeching, howling, and running about on shore, distant drums and trumpets, church bells ringing, and having given the order to reload with right cartridge and ball and to house the guns, Jack carried straight on, shaping a course for the Canal di Spalato, followed by Cerbère and Mahon, with Ringle under his lee. He desired Mr. Harding to dismiss the starboard watch once courses had been set, and went below to find Stephen, not dead asleep, but writing. I am setting down a succinct account of my conversation in Spalato with certain organizations for the benefit of the Admiral's intelligence officer in Malta. As soon as it is done, my duty, as I see it, is to go to Algiers as fast as a ship will fly. What do you think we should do? I think we should run down the coast looking into the yards that contain vessels in any state of forwardness. And then, as soon as we've examined Durazzo, straight away for Algiers, keeping the sharpest possible watch for Huario between Pantelleria and Calibia. Then, it being assumed that we do not catch the vessel, I should go on in Ringgold to dissuade the Dey from carrying the promised treasure across, while you remain a very present threat on the horizon. No Pomone? It's no longer a matter of direct physical strength. We've already dealt with the two dangerous heavy frigates, and I have, at enormous expense, set in train a series of measures that will rid us of several smaller but still dangerous vessels repairing or nearing completion. Brigs of war, corvettes, 3 gunboats. Letting Pomone return to Malta with her companion seems to me a masterstroke. Jack considered. Very well, we shall do as you say. As soon as you've finished your account, I'll send it across to Pomone, who will carry it to Valletta. A violent 10-minute downpour had cleared the sky, and day was breaking fair and clear when Stephen followed a midshipman on deck. "Have I done wrong in calling you?" asked Jacob. "I thought you would like to see the first results of our conversations in Spalato." A great trail of smoke drifting west-northwest was very eloquent. "Bertolucci's yard, of course," said Jacob. "It had half-completed Nereid, a corvette. I believe I see French sailors trying to put the fire out." Later in the morning, Stephen made his way into the main-top as the frigate ran, or rather crept, the breeze dying on them, between Sabioncello and Meleda. Papadopoulos' yard on the one and Pavelich's on the other had already been destroyed. Only a little smoke rose from the blackened hulls. Stephen stared fixedly at the southern end of Sabioncello, where, according to his list, there was a small yard belonging to one Boccanegra. But as Boccanegra, a Sicilian, had a father-in-law of importance among the Carbonari, and their sometimes very curious allies, Stephen was not sure that his yard was part of the bargain. With the wind settling into the west, they went reaching down the coast. There was not a night without a fire, great or small, to larboard, and Stephen noticed that whenever the ships were off one of the yards, Jack Aubrey was in the foretop, and Reed high-perched in the schooner's rigging, gazing at the ruin with a grim satisfaction. He also noticed that the gun-room was uneasy. They knew that there was something in the intelligence line at work, something that should not be openly discussed. Yet the satisfaction did exist, and it reached its height off Durazzo itself, with all 7 yards in a blaze that lit the sky. "Well," said Jack, "it may not be very glorious, Stephen, but by God your allies have cleaned the coast marvellously, and although they've lost us a small fortune in prize money, they have saved us a world of time." At Durazzo they stood out, leaving the blaze on their larboard quarter, and sailing across an uneventful sea with a fine topgallant breeze. 2 days later, those that knew these waters well said, "We're in for a right levanter, mate." Jack gazed at the sky, and no one was surprised when he called for preventer stays, rolling tackles, the taking in of topgallants, the rigging of storm jibs and staysails, and the bowsing of the guns so taut up against the sides that their carriages squeaked. When the first gust of the Levanter came racing across the water with a low cloud of spray, it struck the Surprise from astern, a glancing blow that drove her 4 foot deep, so that she gave a sudden peck, a movement so violent that he'd flung Stephen and Jacob the length of the gun-room, together with their backgammon board. 4 bells in the first watch found Stephen at his traditional appointment with the Commodore and toasted cheese. And for once he was early. The door burst open and the Commodore strode in, sure-footed on the heaving deck, and scattering sea-water in most directions. "There you are, Stephen," he cried, his bright blue eyes full of delight. "I am so sorry to have kept you waiting, but I've never enjoyed a Levanter half so much. We're under close-reefed topsails and courses, making close on 14 knots. 14 knots! Should you not like to come on deck and see the bow wave we're throwing?" "But, Jack, do you not fear the impervious horrors of a leeward shore?" "Lord Stephen, what a fellow you are! Don't you know we're in the Ionian already, with no lee shore for 100 sea miles?" "What is the difference between a sea and a land mile? Tell." "Oh, nothing much, except the sea mile is rather longer and very, very much wetter." "Lord, what a wag I am," he said, wiping his eyes. "But leaving wit aside, another 3 days should place us well west of Pantelleria." They were indeed west of Pantelleria before the Levanter died in 6 sullen howls. The 2 surgeons contemplated the shore and the little fishing port from the taffrail. "Mr. Aubrey assures me nothing could have left Algiers. He also states that it is extremely improbable that a Huario could have survived such a tempest. Yet conceivably it might have taken shelter in this harbour. I beg you to accompany the boat which the purser is taking in ostensibly for the purchase of horsehide, and ask whether there is any news. Your Italian is better than mine. Pray urge them to waste not a minute." They wasted not a minute, but returned empty-handed as far as news of the Durazzo Huario was concerned. The captain of the port had no word of any such vessel, and he doubted so light a craft could have survived such a furious blow. Nor, he said, would there be wind of any kind now for at least 3 days. His forecast was accurate. They lay off the island day after day until the dreadful calm ended in light and variable breezes, and the Surprise could work towards the Bay of Algiers. At the crack of dawn, Commodore Aubrey sent a boy to rouse Stephen Maturin. "Lord, how brilliant!" he cried, blundering up the ladder to the quarter-deck, his eyes half closed against the light. Jack led him to the starboard bow. The ship was ghosting along under courses, and from here he beheld a vast expanse of gloriously blue sea, and a great convoy of merchantmen upon it, perhaps 100 sail of ships, British, Dutch, Scandinavian, and American, gathered from Tripoli, Tunis, and further east, with the 2 corvettes and the sloop that Jack had sent to protect them strung out to windward, while still farther off a practised eye could make out some long, low-built Corsairs waiting their opportunity. "That gives you some notion of the trade, don't you find?" asked Jack. "But come over this side. You'll see another sight." He guided Stephen to the larboard cathead, where they stood gazing across an even deeper blue expanse of sea to the African shore. The sun was lighting first the mountains behind Algiers and on either side, brilliant green after the spring rains, and then in a few moments the splendid topmost buildings on the tall, symmetrically rounded hill upon which the city was built. "That is the Kasbah, the Dey's palace," said Jack. Minute by minute the brilliant light moved on, showing innumerable white, flat-roofed houses, towering minarets, occasional alleys, some blanks that would probably be great squares if one could see them from above, row after row of houses going down and down to the prodigious great stone wall, the port, the huge mole, and the inner harbour. "There is a strange beauty here," said Stephen. "Now, brother, I have a note that must be delivered into the consul's own hands. You will let me have Ringle for greater stateliness, and if you do not mind, I will take Dr. Jacob to show me the way." "Of course. But you may have to wait for the land breeze in the evening to carry you out again." Very fine Ringle was, as she stood in, came sweetly against the mole, and moored there to the admiration of all beholders. But there the stateliness of the mission stopped. Dr. Maturin had eluded the vigilance of Killick, and was now walking along the mole with Jacob in his rusty old black coat, with his breeches unbuttoned at the knee. He was a disreputable object, with his wig awry and blue spectacles on his nose. And his companion was not much better, dressed in a rather old grey caftan and a grey skull-cap. "It is indeed a most prodigious wall," said Stephen. 40 feet high, said Jacob. "I measured it long ago with a string." They entered the town through a heavily fortified gate, but without formalities. The Turkish guards looked at them curiously, but at Jacob's brief statement that they were from the English ship, they stood aside. A few narrow streets, a small square with an almond tree, through yet another maze to a larger square. It was the slave market, Jacob observed in a matter-of-fact tone. And the next stage a climb of some 500 steps, almost to the Kasbah itself. Jacob was panting when he turned off right-handed. "There is the consulate," he said, pointing to a considerable house with a garden full of date palms. "Should you like to draw breath before going in?" "Never in life," said Stephen. "Let us not lose a minute." He and Jacob walked through the side door, obviously intended for business, and in the office they found a young man sitting at a desk. "Who the devil are you?" he asked. "Distressed British subjects, I suppose. My name is Dr. Stephen Maturin, surgeon in HMS Surprise, and I wish to see the consul." He laid a card on the desk. The young man changed colour. "I will speak to her ladyship." "Dr. Maturin," she cried, running in, a remarkably handsome woman of 35 or so. "You will not remember me, but we met in Sierra Leone when Peter was on Governor Wood's staff. Of course you shall see him. You will not mind his being in bed, I'm sure. It is the hip gout, and he suffers most cruelly." Her eyes filled with tears. "Dear Lady Clifford, I remember you perfectly. You wore a pearl grey dress to dinner, and it became you wonderfully. May I present my colleague, Dr. Jacob?" "How do you do, sir?" said Lady Clifford, and she led them upstairs to a sadly tumbled bedroom. "Dr. Maturin, I do apologize for receiving you like this," said the consul, "but I dare not get up. The fit has just died away, and I fairly dread waking it." Stephen explained Jacob's presence, then passed the letter he was carrying. Sir Peter said, "Forgive me," and broke the seal. "Yes," he said, putting the letter by, "it's perfectly clear. But, my dear sir, have you had news from Algiers since the beginning of April?" "We have not. Between this and Durazzo we touched only at Pantelleria, where they had nothing to tell us." "Oh, Lord," said the consul, lying back on his pillows. "We've heard such tales of Commodore Aubrey playing old Harry in the Adriatic, Frenchmen being sunk, Algerines shockingly battered, shipyards going up in flames by the score. But you cannot know that the situation here is wholly changed, and that my influence with the Dey no longer exists. He was strangled by the Janissaries, and they've elected their current Aga, Omar Pasha, as the new Dey. His mother was a Turk, and he speaks Turkish and Arabic with equal fluency, and some Greek. Illiterate in all three, but by reputation a man of very strong character. Sir, could a meeting with the new Dey be arranged as soon as possible, perhaps tomorrow?" "I'm afraid not. The Dey is hunting the lion of the Atlas, his favourite pursuit, and the vizier will be at the nearest oasis of comfort." "Consul," said Stephen after a considering pause, "can you tell me how much influence the vizier may possess?" "Oh, it is very great. He's an intelligent and literate man with highly placed connections in Constantinople. Quite apart from that, Hashin has a wide acquaintance with the chief men in the Muslim states of Africa and the Levant. He is also, I may add, fluent in French." "In that case," said Stephen, "it seems to me that Dr. Jacob and I should make our way into the Atlas with the utmost dispatch. Is the vizier incorruptible, do you think? I cannot honestly speak to that. But in these parts a present is rarely unwelcome. I've seen him with an aquamarine in his turban. Oh! The consul's face twisted with pain. Jacob, begging his leave, hurried out into the town, returning with a phial of thebaic tincture, with which Stephen promptly dosed the patient to his relatively swift relief. They followed the track up and over a cold pass and down to Khadna and its fields, the last village before the oasis, then the Shat and the wilderness. Dusk was falling before they reached it, and they hardly noticed the blue-clad figure of a little girl waiting outside the thorn hedge. But clearly she could see them and called out, "Sarah!" At this the tall, gaunt camel, a particularly ill-tempered creature that had carried Stephen over a broad stretch of sand, broke into a lumbering run, and on reaching the child lowered its great head to be embraced. These were camels that belonged to the village, and they moved off to their usual place even before their trifling return loads were unstrapped. While the guards and attendants set up tents, Stephen and Jacob were taken to the chief man's house, where they were regaled with coffee and biscuits sopped in warm honey, extremely difficult to keep from dripping onto the beautiful rugs upon which they sat. Jacob was perfectly at home and distributed the customary little presents, blessing the house as they left it. As they crossed the dark enclosure to their tent, they heard hyena quite close. The next day was hard going, up and down, but very much more of the up, more and more stony. At the top of a barren rise, while the Turks made a fire for their coffee, their guide led them along the track to a point where the rock fell precipitously and the path wound down and down to a dry valley with one green spot in it, an oasis. Beyond the dry valley the ground rose again, yet beyond it there shone a great sheet of water, the Shat el-Khadna, fed by a stream that could just be made out on the right before the mountain hid it. "I have been thinking," said Jacob, "that it might be better if I appeared as a mere dragoman. The vizier is fluent in French, so there is no need for my presence, and you would more readily reach an understanding, the two of you alone, particularly if you conciliate his goodwill with the lapis lazuli brooch that a Cainite cousin let me have in Algiers. He told me that there was another Cainite, one of the Beni Mzab, a calligrapher, in the vizier's suite, and that is another reason why I suggest being a dragoman, no more, on this occasion." The Turkish guards and their horses having a sense of occasion, they made their entrance in a reasonably stylish manner. They rode through the cultivated fields of the oasis, all brilliant green beneath the towering date palms, round the central pool to a low, spreading house with barns and stables. "The Deysh hunting lodge," said Jacob. "I was here once as a boy." An official came out of the gateway, calling what Stephen took to be greetings. Then grooms led horses and packed mules into the stable yard, while Stephen and Jacob walked into the forecourt. "This is Ahmed ben Hanbal, the vizier's under-secretary," said Jacob. The under-secretary bowed, putting his hand to his forehead and heart. "The chief secretary is with the Dey. Shall we walk in?" Inside the curious pillared patio, enclosed with elaborate wrought-iron screens, Jacob said something to Ahmed, who hurried away. "Here," said Jacob, passing a letter in a little box. Stephen clicked it open, gazed with admiration at the splendid blue stone, the size and shape of an egg cut in two lengthways. He smiled at Jacob, who said, "I shall leave you now. In a minute you will be announced to the vizier." The minute tended to be a long one, and Stephen looked secretly at the stone again. He'd rarely seen so true an azure, and the gold rim echoed the golden specks within the stone quite admirably. but a most unwelcome comparison welled up in his mind. His wife Diana had possessed an extraordinary blue diamond. She was buried with it. A blue of an entirely different nature, of course, but he felt the familiar chill grip him, a sort of frigid indifference to virtually everything, and he welcomed the opening door. It showed a cross-looking, very tall greybeard, his height increased by a lofty white turban, who beckoned imperiously and walked before him into a room where a middle-aged man in white clothes was sitting cross-legged on a low couch, smoking a hookah. "The Christian," said Greybeard loudly. He bowed very low and walked out backwards. "Good day to you, sir," said Stephen in French. "I have an introduction to His Highness the Dey from His Britannic Majesty's Consul in Algiers, but before delivering it to him and carrying out the rest of my mission, I thought it proper to pay my respects to you and perhaps, if it is customary, to show you the letter. Since I have been told that you speak perfect French, I have left my interpreter behind." The vizier rose, bowed, and said, "You are very welcome, sir. Pray sit down. I do speak French. It is my mother tongue, since one of my father's wives came from Marseille, and it is indeed customary to show any document intended for the Dey to his chief minister. Pray smoke, if you feel so inclined, while I read it." Rarely had Stephen's sense of politeness been put to such a test, but choosing the least worn of the hookah's mouthpieces, he smoked with every appearance of composure. Not for long, however, for the vizier said, "The letter speaks of a private and confidential mission. The Dey is at present hunting the lion in the Khadna Valley, so perhaps if you were to tell me its general nature—" "By all means, but first may I beg you to accept this trifling token of my personal esteem?" He laid the box within hand's reach. The vizier opened it, and his face changed. "What a stone!" he exclaimed. "I have never seen its like for perfection. Many, many thanks indeed, my dear sir. And let us indeed turn to the reason for your very welcome presence in this wilderness." "Well, sir, it has come to the knowledge of the British ministry that several numerous Shiite confederacies and brotherhoods along the Adriatic and Ionian coasts and inland to Serbia, who support Bonaparte, have combined to intervene in his favour by doing all they can to prevent the junction of the Russian and Austrian armies. A Moroccan ruler has laid down a very large sum in gold for the necessary mercenaries, and messengers were sent to Algiers from Durazzo, begging the Dey to transport this treasure. His Britannic Majesty's government would be very deeply grieved indeed if any help were given to these people." The vizier gazed at him with a wondering benevolence. "Surely, my dear sir," he said at last, "a man of your egregious perspicacity cannot believe these wild tales. His Highness is a most orthodox Sunnite, while the agitators in Herzegovina and those parts are violent Shiites. They have turned to a notorious Shiite sheikh in Morocco. For them to ask the Orthodox Dey to help them at this point passes belief, even if the Dey had not hated Bonaparte ever since his vile conduct at Jaffa, Acre, and Aboukir, and even if he were not an admiring friend of King George, he will tell you so himself. But come, let me call for a soothing bath, a meal. Then early tomorrow I will mount you on your dragoman on decent horses, and confide you to one of the Dey's huntsmen, who will take you across the mountain and down to the Arpad River that feeds the Shat el Khadna. It is a vast game preserve. No ordinary people are allowed into it without a pass, and those who do adventure are impaled." Very early in the morning, Stephen and Amos Jacob rode southward from the oasis. The parting had been quite cordial, and the vizier had sent the Dey all possible expressions of devotion. They rode on through the damp and misty dawn, Stephen and Jacob, on strong, capable geldings. The beginning of the scrub country came with striking abruptness, immediately after the green of the oasis, and before they were 10 minutes from the oasis, the young huntsman Ibrahim had shown them the footprints of several jackals and a hyena. The road grew steeper, winding up in curves laboriously cut into the rock, and as the sun climbed, the men and their horses went on up to the very top of the ridge where the forest began. The road had not descended 5 minutes before it was winding through noble oaks, beeches, and chestnuts, and presently, where the path narrowed between tall crags, there was a gate with huts for soldiers right and left. Ibrahim showed the vizier's pass. The guards opened the gate, and they rode through onto a little plain, 10 acres or so of grass, and stopped to gaze down over the sea of treetops to the vast expanse of the Shatt el-Khadna. Ibrahim pointed away, and Jacob translated, "He says he will show you the Shatt, which has countless red birch on it. We are obliged to go down that way because the direct slopes are very severe." They rode down until the ground levelled, and through a grove of tamarisks to the shore of the lake, and here before them were countless flamingos in the water, with their long-necked heads deeply immersed, or staring about, or gossiping with a sound like geese. Those within 20 yards of the horseman rose into the air with a most glorious show of scarlet. Stephen was entranced, and Jacob turned a beaming face towards him and cried, "I had no idea such splendour existed." Ibrahim spoke with great earnestness. "He says we should hurry," said Jacob. "We are late, which the Dey cannot bear." The Dey's hunting camp proved to be a number of small tents tucked into an unexpected dell some way from the river. Ibrahim led them up through a stand of oaks, and at the guarded descent he showed his pass again. They were led to a tent with a heap of rugs in it, whose colours glowed like jewels when the sun touched them. The chief huntsman came to say that Omar Pasha would now receive them. They found the Dey in a high state of good humour. Stephen bowed and said, "May I present His Britannic Majesty's government's greetings and good wishes to His Highness Omar Pasha." Omar rose, bowed, and said he was most gratified by his English cousin's friendly message. He desired them to sit down and called for coffee and a hookah. "I have just succeeded in putting these together," he said, observing that Stephen's eye was keenly turned upon a beautiful pair of double-barrelled rifled guns. "I took the plates off to look at the sear, but for a great while I was puzzled to get them and the sear spring back again. However, with God's help, it is done." The Pasha looked so pleased at his success that Stephen asked whether he might look at the nearer gun. "By all means," said the Dey, and put it into his hands. The gun was much lighter than Stephen had expected, and it came up to his shoulder almost like a fowling piece. "You are accustomed to guns, I find," said the Dey, smiling. "Indeed I am, sir," replied Stephen. "I have shot many a creature with them, partly for sport and partly for study." Coffee and the pipe came in, and after a longish pause in which they smoked and drank, Stephen said, "I do not believe I have ever had better nor more welcome coffee. But now, sir, with your permission, I will deliver the message that His Majesty's ministry has entrusted to me. It has come to their knowledge that several numerous Shiite brotherhoods and confederacies along the Adriatic and Ionian coast and inland to Serbia, who support Bonaparte, have combined to intervene in his favour by doing all they can." "Bonaparte, that son of a dog! Your master must have some very weak advisers," said the Dey. "Very weak? if they can believe that after his Royal Navy has so battered Bonaparte's friends in the Adriatic. I love the Royal Navy. I knew Sir Smith at Acre. But I leave all these things to my vizier. He understands politics. For my part, I understand soldiers. And I know that this Bonaparte must fall. He has gone beyond what is allowed, and he must fall. He jerked his head and muttered, looking intensely disagreeable. But presently his eye fell on the guns once more, and with a far more amiable expression he said, "So you are interested in hunting, sir? Then should you like to hunt a lion with me? I mean to lie in wait for one tomorrow evening." "I should like it of all things, sir. But I have not so much as a fowling piece with me." "As for that, you may choose either of these and grow used to it, shooting all through the afternoon, and then in the evening with your guns still warm and supple. We will walk along the river bank, and, God willing, have the kindest moon." "Indeed we shall, with the blessing." "Let us draw straws for the first to fire." Omar, with barely concealed pleasure, drew the longer. He at once began showing Stephen the management of the rifle, an American weapon unfamiliar to Stephen, and when they walked into the open, first to fire some random shots into the sky, and then to shoot deliberately at a candle, a lion far down on the lake shore began a series of great coughing roars that carried wonderfully on the still evening air. The next morning Stephen and Jacob, taking some bread and mutton with them, spent most of their time on the bank of the Schat. Jacob improving Stephen's rudimentary Arabic, Berber, and Turkish, Stephen telling him the elements of ornithology. But their main business was learning the nature of the gun, and Stephen shot at fixed marks far and near. On their way back at dusk, they met Ibrahim, sent to look for them. "Omar Pasha was afraid you might have lost your way and that the lamb might be overcooked," he said. "Please to step out." "There you are!" cried the Dey as they came down into the dell and its scent of wood smoke and roasting mutton. "Come, tell me, how did you find the gun?" "I have never fired with a better," said Stephen. "It is a beautiful gun." The Dey laughed with pleasure. And then, when the lamb was no more than a heap of bones, and when Omar, his chief huntsman, and the two guests had eaten cakes made of dried figs and dates moistened with honey and followed by coffee, and when the glow of the moon was just beginning to tinge the sky behind the mountain, the Dey stood up and uttered a formal prayer. They set off, first climbing from the dell, then dropping to the stream and its almost bare, well-trodden bank. By now Stephen's eyes were accustomed to the dimness, and as the rising moon shed an even greater light through the trees, he might have been walking along a broad highway with Omar Pasha close before him. Omar stopped and pointed to a mass of bare rock emerging from the trees. With infinite precaution they crept up to a small, low-ceilinged cave. At the front, where it opened onto the stream, it was quite wide enough for two, and they sat comfortably, their guns across their knees, gazing down at a path that grew more and more distinct as the great moon mounted higher in the sky. The air was warm and most uncommonly still, and Stephen heard a pair of nightjars chirring. A long, long pause, interrupted only by the passage of a porcupine, and then Omar stiffened, and Stephen saw the large pale form of a lion pace swiftly across their field of vision. A scattering of low bushes hid him after a few seconds, but Stephen was left the sharpest possible image of a great, smoothly moving creature, pale and with a pale mane, a perfectly confident animal, between 9 and 10 feet long. Way on the left, there was a crashing of branches, a wild flailing about, some high, desperate shrieks, a very deep, sustained growling. Now the minutes passed very slowly, both men extremely tense. Then, after a long, extraordinarily expectant wait, the sound of movement among the downstream bushes. The lion came clearly into sight, carrying a wild boar, high, well to the left to free the stride of his leg. Nearer, nearer. And when he was just going from them, Omar rose and shot him behind the right ear. But though the lion fell, he was on his feet again the next moment, roaring with fury. Omar shot him again, and this time he fell with no other movement. But now his lioness was there. She lowered her head over him, licking his death wound and moaning. Then she looked up directly into the cave with the men and charged straight for them. Stephen saw her eyes clear in the moonlight. It was a mere fairground shot, and with regret he killed her as she rose in her last leap. For most of the next day, Stephen and Amos Jacob rode well ahead of their companions. They had come from the farewell feast with the day's absolute assurance that not an ounce of gold for the Shiite heretics should ever pass through Algiers while he was Dey. He would send the vizier a direct order to that effect in case there should ever have been a ghost of misunderstanding. Now they hoped that by setting a fine brisk pace they would bring the whole group to the vizier's oasis before nightfall. "Well," said Jacob, "you have not yet told me your opinion of the day." "My first impression was that he was a mere soldier, a cheerful brute, and likeable but perfectly capable of turning very wicked. Then, after a while, I began to wonder whether his simplicity was quite what it seemed. I discovered on my baggage mule his wonderfully handsome present, the American rifle that killed the lioness. You know as well as I that an excess of mistrust is very widely spread in our calling, and something compelled me to look very carefully indeed at lock, stock, and both barrels before I could thank him wholeheartedly. A man we both knew was killed by the explosion of a fowling piece that burst when he fired it. A gift, of course. William Durand. He was incautious. But then, what of his vizier? I should not trust him in any matter of importance. The blowing of a horn far behind them. They turned, and there was the best mounted of the Turkish guards hurrying after them. Jacob relayed his panting words. He fears that the Scirocco will be with us in an hour or two. Looking southward, he added, "If we'd not been prating so eagerly, I should have noticed it long before. You see that dark bar over the mountain range behind us? That is the precursor. Presently the southeast wind will begin to blow, and then the Scirocco will reach us. It's hot air filled with very fine sand. We should press on." Towards its end their journey grew more horrible with every 100 yards traversed, with a dense cloud of fine sand quite hiding the moon and making its way through protective cloths held over mouth and nose. The hot wind was growing stronger still when finally a rift in the veil of flying sand showed the oasis. It being late, the porters were unwilling to unbar the gates. But Ahmed, the under-secretary, hearing the controversy and recognizing Jacob's voice, soon induced them to do their duty. He asked Jacob whether he should warn the vizier. "By no means," said Jacob, "but if you could give these people food and drink and allow Dr. Maturin and me to have a bath, we should be immeasurably grateful." Down, 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 into a blessed sleep. Stephen, washed clean of sand, fed, watered, wrapped in clean linen, sank to those perfect depths where even the howl of the Scirocco could not disturb him. Nothing but strong, determined hands could claw him up to the infinitely unwelcome surface. But this they did, and there was the insufferable Jacob shaking Stephen awake. "Your soul to the devil, Amos! What is it, for the love of God?" "Listen now, Stephen. Ahmed is a Canaanite too. We recognize one another at once. And being entirely on our side, he has shown me a copy of the vizier's message to the Sheikh of Asgar, Ibn Hazm. It tells him to recall his caravan at once and to load the treasure aboard a fast-sailing xebec at Arzila, a little shallow fishing harbor in Shiite territory just north of Laraish. Yahya bin Khaled, the captain of the xebec, and the most capable and fortunate Corsair in Algiers will wait there with a very strong guard until the wind comes into the west, and then he will pass through the Strait of Gibraltar in the darkness, with the wind and the strong eastward current driving him at great speed, and head straight for Durazzo." Stephen sat considering, and then he nodded and said, "There was no mention of rewarding Ahmed." "None. I believe his offer was perfectly straightforward. But I gathered that a kind word to the governor of Malta to allow him to set up in Valletta, where he has cousins, would be welcome." "Very well. How early may we start?" "I no longer hear the wind. It stopped at 4:30. Obviously we cannot start before the morning prayer. It would look suspicious. Yet at first light I shall cause the Turkish guards to make ready." A long road it was and weary, deep in sand, while the gardens on the outskirts of Algiers, when at last they reached them, were desolation itself, with greenery for the most part blown off to lie in withering heaps. And from a turn on the mountain road which gave them a clear view of the port and harbours, it was clear to Stephen's searching telescope that Ringle was not there. Nor was she in the offing. He barely had the heart to search the horizon for the larger, more conspicuous sails of surprise, before clapping his glass to with disappointment. "My dear Amos," he said, "may I beg you to settle accounts with our guide and these good Turks, and then to join me at the consulate?" Jacob agreed, and they parted. In spite of his anxiety, Stephen noticed an air of excitement in the city as he rode in. Groups of people talking louder than usual, making gestures whose meaning escaped him, so many people that sometimes they almost blocked the way. He was recognized at once at the consulate, and Lady Clifford informed of his arrival. "Dear Dr. Maturin," she cried, "how glad I am to see you! You had an unspeakably horrid ride, I'm afraid. A really shocking sirocco like that makes you long for the Yorkshire moors." "Certainly, but may I ask how Sir Peter does?" "Oh, very well indeed, I thank you. I've never seen such a change in him. But will you not come and see him? He keeps his room because he has a great deal of work." The consul sprang up very much more briskly than might have been expected in a man so recently crippled. "Dr. Maturin," he cried, taking both Stephen's hands, "how very much obliged I am to you and your colleague for your precious remedy. I've scarcely thought about that shocking pain these last 3 days. Sit down, I beg. You must have had a cruel ride. Did you meet 2 or 3 squadrons of horse on your way back?" "No, sir." "I must have taken the lower road. But tell me, how did your journey go?" "First," said Stephen, "may I ask what has become of the schooner Ringle? I have news of the very first consequence that I must communicate to Commodore Aubrey." "Alas! In the last stages of that frightful blow, the Commodore called the schooner to him. I gathered that a ship of the Royal Navy was dismasted, and Aubrey needed the schooner to help save her. I'm sorry to give you what is, I fear, very bad news. I'm also sorry to tell you that this evening a new day will be proclaimed, Omar Pasha having been strangled by executioners sent to the Khadna Valley with those squadrons I mentioned." Ali Bey being proclaimed, the city grew wonderfully calm for the evening prayer. But the last pious words were barely said before the roaring blast of the Algerine batteries saluted the sky, and thousands of Janissaries and all those citizens who valued their well-being bawled out the name of Ali, competing with countless trumpets and drums. The city now settled down, as did Jacob, in an obscure lodging-house near the Gate of Woe, a house in which his less presentable Algerine and Berber friends would excite no comment, whereas they might well compromise the official residence. Stephen ate there daily when he was not staring at the horizon or walking about Algiers with Jacob. It was on one of these days passing through the now active slave market that Jacob, catching sight of an acquaintance, a jewel merchant, begged Stephen to wait for him. "I shall not be long," he said. "Let us meet at the coffee-house there, in the far corner." "Certainly," said Stephen. And he was wandering slowly through his ultimate unhappiness and desolation, when he heard a voice lost in misery say, "Oh, for the love of God," in Irish. He turned and saw two small children, a boy and a girl, ugly, dirty and thin, tied arm to arm by string. The cheerful merchant called out to Stephen, first in Arabic, then in a mostly Spanish lingua franca, that he should have them for a trifle. They were healthy, and in a few years, if fed moderately, would be capable of severe labour. Even now they could be used for pleasure. "I shall speak to them," said Stephen. "They were twins," said the boy, "Kevin and Mona Fitzpatrick, from Ballydonegan. They'd gone to Dursey Island with cousin Rory in the boat for crab. Somehow the boat came adrift while Rory was with his sweetheart, and they were swept out to sea, and Corsairs raiding along the coast took them aboard." Stephen spoke now to the merchant in the usual indifferent horse-coper's tone. "I should like to know what kind of a price such goods fetch in this city." "4 guineas for the boy, sir, and I will throw in the girl for the honour of your custom." "Very well," said Stephen, "but you must give me a receipt." The merchant bowed, wrote on a piece of paper, sealed it, received the coins, cut the string, and formally passed the children over with the customary blessing. Stephen returned the civility, told the children he'd bought them, bade each take a hand, and led them across the market to the coffee-house. "Amos, do you think the people here would have something suitable for children? I've just bought 2. "Have they teeth?" "Kevin and Mona, have you teeth?" They nodded very gravely and showed them. "Then I shall call for yoghurt, sugared, and soft bread." "Pray, what was the language in which you spoke to them?" "Irish." Jacob gave his order and asked, "Do these children speak no English?" "I will ask." Mona said that she could say most of a Hail Mary. Kevin only hung his head. "Do you think that kind woman by the gate of woe would wash and clothe them?" "Fatima, I'm sure of it." Stephen spent a pleasant evening feeding the children, ingenuous little creatures, with Fatima. Jacob was visiting a Lebanese cousin who also dealt in gemstones, though on a much larger scale, and in negotiating loans. Coming back when Stephen was in bed, he asked him whether he was asleep. "I am not," said Stephen. "Then let me tell you that my cousin has had news that Ibn Hazm's caravan began its return yesterday. It is difficult country, and they will need 10 days to reach Asgard, let alone the port of Azila. So we have a fortnight to spare." "I rejoice." "And Abdul Rais, the head of one of the Corsair groups, says that the wind will diminish tomorrow. If we like to see some of his galleys, we shall be welcome at the inner harbour, but quite early in the day, because he will set out for Sardinia before noon." Stephen was awakened at dawn the following day by a little girl's voice in his ear, asking whether there were any cows to be milked. There were not, but there was water to be drawn with Fatima's help, faces to be washed, prayers to be said, and a perfectly delightful breakfast to be eaten. Bananas and dates amazed the children. In a little hidden court behind, soft bread toasted on the brazier that kept the coffee warm, toasted and spread with honey. "Here is the other gentleman," said the children. "Good morning, sir. God be with you." Jacob gave them a Hebrew blessing, drank a great draught of coffee, and Stephen said, "When may we meet Abdul Rais?" "Whenever you choose. The inner harbour is only a few steps." "Then the children can come too." The street was extremely narrow, and parts of it encumbered with sheep, goats, horsemen, and Algerine children. Then, working past 3 heavily laden camels, they were suddenly through the gate, and there was the great sky above them and the sea stretching away, wind whitened still, but much less so, and just this side of its northern limit, Ringle beating in for the shore. The children shied extremely at the sight of the galleys that filled the inner port, and grasped Stephen's hands. The Rais, a formidable red-bearded figure, was markedly affable to Jacob, showing him the arrangement and ordering of his handsome craft. "Dear Amos," Stephen said, "pray ask him whether that vessel on the horizon that is turning so valiantly into the wind will eventually reach this port." Abdul smiled. "The frigate's tender, yes. With the wind lessening like this, she may get in by night." "If I do not mistake," Stephen said, "she will soon be in the galley's path, steering for Sardinia. If the Rais would put us aboard her, I will give him any sum you think proper." The request received an amiable smile from the Rais. "I shall settle with Fatima and bring our belongings," said Jacob, and hurried away. Orders, cries in much the same peremptory tone usual in the Royal Navy, and the galley began its smooth glide toward the harbour's mouth. The silent children pressed against Stephen's side. The open sea. The Rais loosed the sheet and attended to Jacob's further explanation. His red beard opened in a laugh, and he said, "If your friend will guarantee the tender will not fire upon us, I will put you aboard for the love of God." When this was relayed to him, Stephen bowed to the Rais and took the children into the bows, where he showed them the wonders of his little telescope. This occupied them until the two vessels were so close that he could distinctly make out William Reed. Stephen waved his handkerchief. "Why, sir, and here you are!" cried Reed when the vessels had closed, heaving Stephen inboard with a child in each hand. "How very happy I am to see you, and how happy the Commodore will be. He's been fairly eating his heart out in Mahon. William, for all love, tell me about Surprise and the Commodore." "Certainly, Doctor. It was the day that horrible blow began. The Commodore was far out in the offing helping a disabled ship, Lion, totally dismasted. When we arrived we could scarcely see 50 yards for the sand and the flying spray, but we did make out that Surprise had managed to pass Lion at tow, to get our head round a little. Then a heavy Dutchman, part of a scattered convoy, came hurtling down under almost bare poles, saw us at the last, but struck Surprise just abaft the starboard cathead, carrying away her bowsprit, heads, her forefoot, much of her gripe, and starting God knows how many butt ends." Stephen and Jacob both knew enough of the sea to have some notion of the appalling situation of the 3 ships in question. "It's difficult to believe that we survived those God knows how many days. All the beds aboard Surprise had to be stuffed into those shocking started butts where the sea came pouring in for the first 2 days in spite of all the fothering in the world. It was a rough time with the pumping alone, and I've never seen so much grog drunk with so little effect. And the people behaved very well, never a cross word, and we limped into Mahon on Tuesday morning. When the wind veered just enough to let us out of Mahon, the Commodore sent me off to fetch you. And then the wind shifted right back into the south, and we thought we should never see Africa again. Nor did I think I should ever again bless a southerly gale, though this one is all a man could wish. Indeed, it was now the kindest breeze, and late the next morning it wafted him up the long, long inlet to Port Mahon, where the naval yard echoed with the caulker's mallets thundering upon the Lion's hull. But out in the fairway there rode Surprise, apparently as trim as ever she had been, with her captain in a boat under her newly painted bows. As soon as he was aware of the Ringles' presence, he spun the boat about and pulled rapidly across the harbour. "A very hearty welcome to you all," he cried, shaking their hands. "How very glad I am to see you. Come back to the ship with me, doctors, and we'll have dinner together." "Mona," said Stephen, "make your bob to the Commodore. Kevin, make your leg." Jack bowed to each in return and said, "These are your slaves, I presume?" "Just so," said Stephen. It was very like a homecoming, and as Stephen gazed about the frigate's spotless deck, he felt that he might have been aboard Surprise fresh from Sepping's yard, rather than on a vessel that had undergone a battering so severe that she very nearly went down with all hands. It was true, though, that Jack Aubrey looked 20 years older and quite thin. The traces of extreme hard labour and fatigue were evident on most of the faces, the smiling faces, that he saw. "I've been bursting with my news," Stephen said as soon as Jack and he were in the cabin. "The day has been murdered. The gold very soon will be aboard a very rapid vessel in the port of Arzila. This galley is to attempt the passage of the strait by night with a favourable wind. Is it reasonable that we should lie here inactive? I knew the facts in Algiers, and it almost killed me being unable to tell you because of that cruel south wind and the days passing. How well I understand your pain, dear Stephen, said Jack. But you must recollect that these same southerly gales have been blowing elsewhere. They've kept almost all shipping on the west coast of Spain and Portugal in port, and even new-built ships of the line did not attempt the strait and its wicked lee shore until last Monday. Your Moorish galley would never have ventured out in such seas. Take comfort, brother. Drink up a glass of gin, and enjoy your dinner. The Admiral's coming, and his politico, and your friend Mr. Wright. It was a much relieved Dr. Maturin who stood on deck as Admiral Fanshawe stepped from a coach, followed by his secretary and political adviser. Before he set foot on deck, hats flew off, and the Marines presented arms with a perfectly simultaneous crash. Some time after this, an aged, shabby gentleman, wearing the clothes of another age, and followed by two porters carrying a copper tube, arrived in the already crowded great cabin. Mr. Wright, wholly unconscious of untimeliness and fuss, unsealed one end of the tube, gave the other end to the Commodore to hold, and withdrew the gleaming narwhal's horn, perfect without a hint of repair. "It is a masterpiece," cried Stephen. "Thank you, sir. Thank you very much indeed." In time they were all seated, and the news of the horn's perfect restoration spread rapidly through the frigate. The ship's luck was aboard again. Killick's shrewish face beamed once more, his messmates smiled and slapped him on the back as he travelled to and from the galley. Good humour is charmingly infectious, particularly aboard a ship. Conversation at table very soon rose to a fine volume of sound, and Mr. Wright had to strain his quavering old voice to give Stephen an account of the many mathematical calculations and even advanced physical studies in strongly flowing water to determine the effect of the narwhal's horn spirals on the animal's progress, all to no effect yet. "God love us," said Joe Place, taking his ease on the quarter-deck. "What a din they do make, to be sure." But Jacob was using the noise, saying quietly to the politico, "I believe my colleague is anxious to have a word with you." And in a reasonably subtle manner they arranged for a private meeting somewhat later in the day. But their professional cunning was cast away entirely when the party came to an end, and the Admiral openly asked Stephen to come with him and speak about affairs in Algiers. This he did, and Admiral Fanshawe listened gravely. "Well," he said when Stephen had finished, "I'm sorry for Omar Pasha. He was a likeable ruffian. But I believe Lord Barmouth will think that we gain from the change." "Lord Barmouth, sir?" said Stephen, startled. "Why, yes, he's superseded Lord Keith, and it is to him that you'll have to address your report. You are displeased, Dr. Maturin?" "I beg pardon, sir," said Stephen. "He's a very distinguished sailor," though, as Stephen knew, one who disliked Jack. "But Lord and Lady Keith had a long-standing friendship for Captain Aubrey, and I had hoped that the Admiral would do everything to reinforce his scattered squadron to make the capture of the Arzila galley more probable." "Oh, I'm sure that Lord Barmouth will do his utmost," said Admiral Fanshawe. "But the forces at his disposal are precious thin on the ground. Still," he said, "I wish you the best of success, and at least you have a fair wind for your voyage." So it proved, with a gentle breeze a little north of east. Though the surprise did not find the commander-in-chief in Gibraltar, he was exercising the vessels under his command, the ships of the line to port, the sloops and minor craft to starboard, in line abreast, and well behind them sailed a convoy of merchantmen. This surprising armada was reported from the masthead as the morning cleared. The signal midshipman and his yeoman watched the continual stream of hoists running up aloft as Lord Barmouth put his fleet through a variety of manoeuvres and expressed a variety of comments, mostly unfavourable. At last Surprise's number appeared, together with Commodore Repair Aboard Flag. "I'm happy to see you, Mr. Aubrey," said Lord Barmouth, giving him a cold hand. "I've heard something of your success, and I congratulate you. Have you prepared a report?" "Not yet, my lord." "Then you can come back to Gibraltar with us and let me have it there. I should be obliged if you would send your political adviser and his colleague across to confer. And, Aubrey, although Lord Keith gave you quite a handsome squadron, it has melted away for convoy duty and the like, so perhaps it would be more proper if you were to strike your broad pennant and revert to a private ship." Jack had intended to ask the Commander-in-Chief whether there was news of the French or Allied armies, but these last words were so disobliging that he merely took his leave. Back in the Surprise he struck his broad pennant, told Harding to follow the flag into Gibraltar, and sent for the logbooks. He was still establishing the bases of his reports when he heard the boats return. Coming below, Stephen looked attentively at his friend and said, "You are low in your spirits, brother." "Indeed I am. For your own ear alone, I'm very much afraid that we're going to be balked of our galley. I fear I may be set aside and the chance given to some more favoured man." "Be easy in your mind, my dear," said Stephen. "Did you not know that Lord Barmouth has recently married Admiral Horton's young widow? It is her absence that makes him crosser than usual. Now, Jacob and I have just been talking with the Commander-in-Chief and his politico, then with the politico alone, Matthew Arden, a very intelligent man, very influential in Whitehall. I do wish you could have heard how Arden exulted at your doing in the Adriatic, and how he obliged the Commander-in-Chief to acknowledge that the elimination of that particular danger was a most important feat. Furthermore, I'm happy to say that Lord Barmouth is in awe of Matthew Arden. No, Jack, I do not believe for a moment he will use you ill in these circumstances." "Dear Lady Keith," said Stephen Maturin as they sat in the parlour overlooking her fine garden and the strait, with misty Africa on the far side, "do you remember the first time you ever saw a man without his wig?" "No. Papa always took it off when he was teaching me to swim at Brighton, and I was so much concerned with splashing that I did not remark the change. I asked because my 2 children that I bought in Algiers wept most bitterly when I took mine off this morning, and could not be comforted. Oh, poor little souls! There are those damned apes again. Jack, pray bang on the window, will you? How old are they?" "Just losing their milk teeth. I mean to send them back to their parents. I hope to find a king's ship bound for the Cove of Cork." "But there should be no difficulty. I shall ask the Admiral, and if you like to entrust them to me, I shall tell our chief gardener to put them up. He has a good wife and is a decent man. In any case, I shall look after them." "How deeply kind of you, Lady Keith. I shall bring them up." "Please do. But tell me now, Dr. Maturin, what did you see on the Barbary coast in the way of birds?" But at this the Admiral came bursting in with the cry, "Oh, those hell-damned apes, they're at it again!" His indignant voice changed when he saw the visitors. "Why, Aubrey, how very welcome you are! You too, Doctor. Lord, how you stirred them up in the Adriatic! I do hope you'll both give us the pleasure of your company at dinner on Saturday." "Should be very happy, my lord." The sound of a carriage, of another carriage, the voices of 2 different sets of callers, Jack and Stephen took their leave and walked back to the town, and as they went along the quays Stephen noticed the daily Tangier hoy, it might almost have been called the ferry, rapidly filling with Moors, Gibraltar Jews, and some odd few Spanish merchants, Jacob among them, in a caftan and a skull-cap, wholly inconspicuous. Stephen made no remark, and he was not surprised at finding a suitably obscure note from his colleague saying that he was crossing to see some people who might have some valuable jewels to sell. On his return, Jacob sought out Stephen immediately. "Stephen, I do hope my disappearance did not prove inconvenient. I had sudden word of a friend the other side of the water." "Not in the least. I hope the voyage was worth the displacement." "You shall judge for yourself. On the other side, their notions of security are contemptible, and I have my information from no less than 3 sources. The Argila galley is at present in Tangier, loaded, very heavily manned, and armed. 2 24-pounders in the bows and 2 in the stern. The guns are said to be particularly fine, brass, very exactly bored, with truly spherical and accurate round shot. Murad Reis means to pass the strait on Friday night, making his dash along the European side from Tarifa. Amos, I'm inexpressibly gratified by your news. Will you come and repeat it all to Captain Aubrey? Certainly. Jack listened gravely, his face gradually assuming the look of an eagle that sees its prey. Dr. Jacob, he said, shaking his hand, I thank you very heartily indeed for this matchless piece of intelligence. I shall send a most discreet note across to the flag asking for an interview and begging leave to sail this evening. Killick there! Tell Bondon I shall need the barge directly. Lord Barmouth, looking 10 years younger, received Jack in the great cabin with a cordiality he'd never known before. This note, said the Commander-in-Chief, do you feel entirely confident of your agent's intelligence? Entirely so, my lord. Should commit my ship and myself to the hilt. And Maturin agrees. Then you shall certainly go. But, Aubrey, I had no idea that you were a childhood friend of my wife's, indeed some sort of a cousin. A caster came in this afternoon, bringing her at last. In blooming health, she's a splendid sailor, and as she had a package for Lady Keith, we went straight over to their place. It very soon became apparent that both the women had known you ever since you were breeched, and even before. It was decided that we should ask the Keiths, and you and Dr. Maturin, Lord Keith has the highest opinion of him, to dine with us aboard the flag tomorrow. But I fear this request of yours may put it out of your power. I'm afraid it does, my lord, but I'm very sensible of your goodness. The Admiral rang the bell and told his steward to bring the very old brandy. When it came, he filled their glasses and drank, to surprise and her success. This is famous brandy, upon my word, said Jack, and trying to place Lady Barham, he went on with a certain embarrassment. I never had the honour of serving under Admiral Houghton, and being very often out of England, I never heard either of his marriage or his death. He married Isabel Carrington just after he was given his flag. Isabel Carrington, cried Jack. Of course I should have thought of her when you spoke of Queenie and her. Isabel and Queenie, Lord! Those names bring back such delightfully happy memories. I shall very much look forward to paying my respects to Lady Barmouth. And I thank you most heartily for your permission to sail, my lord. Aboard surprise again. Then, directing his voice over the still water, Jack called, Ringle! Mr. Reed, we shall be moving out into the strait very soon. How easy it seemed. The quiet departure of the 2 vessels a little after the evening gun. Scarcely an order was needed, and scarcely any were uttered. Long-practised hands coiled down the familiar ropes, hauled the bowlines as the ship left the mole, and made all fast with scarcely a conscious reflection. Jack called William Reed to join him and his officers on the quarter-deck. Gentlemen, he said, according to our intelligence, a treasure galley intends to run through the straits tonight. We shall make for Tarifa, Ringle to larboard and the blue cutter to starboard. The first to sight the galley will send up a blue light if the enemy is to starboard, red if to port, and a starburst if the galley is right ahead. No moon, but a most splendid wealth of stars that gave a practised eye a fair view of the Spanish skyline. Tarifa not far off. 4 knots and 2 fathoms, sir, if you please, said the midshipman in charge of the log, murmuring low. There was a steadily mounting sense of crisis aboard, and for some time now the quartermaster had sounded the bells only with his knuckles. Almost no talk or even whispering along the deck, where the guns were already run out and the slow match smouldered in the tubs. It was Daniel, the boatswain's mate in the blue cutter, who first saw the galley. In short of him, 2 fine lateens, sheeted well in and rounded with the breeze. He sent up a blue light, and it showed the enemy clear. Jack signalled Ringle to pick up the cutter and follow him, then spread all the canvas the Surprise could carry in this moderate breeze, increasing as it backed, and he hauled her as close as ever she would lie. The galley, abandoning all hope of racing through the channel, struck her sails and took to her oars, steering into the eye of the wind. The frigate's great spread of white sails showed clearly enough in the starlight for Murad Reis to chance a long shot with his larboard chaser. The heavy guns could not be traversed, they had to be aimed by means of the vessel that carried them, and he moved the rudder with an expert hand. A long shot, but the combination of good aiming, excellent bore and powder, and the toss of the sea caused the 24-pound ball to strike the second gun of the Surprise's starboard broadside, killing Bonden, its captain, and young Hollam, the midshipman of the division. Jack ran the length of the battery, checking the captain's pointing, though indeed the low-lying galley was but the faintest blur, urging highest elevation, and then on the rise he cried, "Fire!" He could not make out for sure whether the guns had had any effect, but after a few more distant exchanges it seemed probable. At all events, after 20 minutes the galley's pace seemed to slacken, either because of damaged oars or because that first dash had exhausted the rowers. With his glass focused on the galley, Jack ordered a forward gun to fire, and in the flash he distinctly saw her making sail. She was fast, and her lateen rig gave her the advantage on a wind, but the morning sun rising over Africa showed the galley almost exactly where Jack had expected her, about 2 miles away westward, and making the most of the topgallant southwest by south wind. And so they ran all that pure cloudless day, and even the next, when sea, wind, and current were almost exactly the same. But the extreme tension of that first day, when every man, woman, and boy tried to urge the frigate on with extraordinary zeal, diminished to the extent that the people went about their ordinary duties without perpetually breaking off to look at the chase. Jack was as active as any of his officers, enjoying the last ounce of thrust from the breeze. And in any case Jack was disinclined for any other occupation whatsoever. He was, of course, thoroughly acquainted with sudden death. But this time he felt the loss of Bonden, an admirable sailor, and of young Hollam, the son of an old shipmate, very deeply indeed. This day was uncommonly hot, and the next hotter still. And now, under the blazing sun, there began a curious form of sea warfare. A slight strengthening of the breeze reached the frigate first and brought her within range of the galley's chasers, but since the vessels were not directly in line, the galley, in order to aim these guns, had to shift her helm, exposing some of her quarter. This danger increased with the wind, which brought Surprise's foremost guns into play, with the further peril that she might put her helm hard over and send her broadside into the galley's relatively fragile timbers. Both captains watched one another intently, trying to detect the slightest change and to counteract it, until the gust that had brought the frigate nearer reached and favoured the Corsair, carrying her out of range. And so it went, burning day after burning day, and now even the moonlit night sky seemed to radiate heat. Day after day, with each doing all that human skill, ingenuity, craft, and malevolence could do to destroy the enemy, neither gaining any decisive advantage, though each wounded the other. It was a Wednesday, the first Wednesday in June, when at last the wind failed them entirely, and they watched the galley ship her oars and pull still westwards towards what might have been a cloud on the horizon, if this pitiless sky would have suffered even a single cloud. Stephen undertook to guide Jacob up into the maintop, from which they could see the galley with a telescope borrowed from the gun-room. It was not a very perilous ascent, but 3 midshipmen ran up into the rigging to give them not only advice, but active, expert muscular heaves at moments of crisis. "Lord, what an expanse," said Jacob after breathing for a while. "And how near the galley seems. May I have the telescope?" "Oh, God!" he added in utter disgust. But I had foreseen it. He passed the telescope. The breeze had filled the galley's sails, and the Corsairs were throwing many of their rowers overboard into water infested with a truly shocking number of sharks. Stephen leant over and called, "Captain Aubrey, the galley has the wind. She's sailing towards an island." For the Cloud had become a conical island, hollowed out on the eastern side. Jack was with them in a moment. "I've heard of their doing that, to save water." And after a silence, "The breeze is joining us." Within minutes the frigate's sails were full, and well before the hellish sun dipped down at last, they were in with the island. There was not a hand aboard who had not seen the rowers thrown screaming into the bloody sea, and there was not one who did not loathe those that did it. The island was presumably volcanic and had blown out its east side, leaving a shallow lagoon with a high wall broken only by a narrow channel. From the tops they could see the galley moored under the rock wall, close to a mole and some derelict buildings. She was entirely sheltered, and the frigate could not enter such shallow water to use her guns. The breeze carried her round the island, surveying and sounding as she went. Deep water. No apparent reefs, almost no vegetation on the land, no sign at all of water. On the west side, under steep cliffs, there was a little grey-green strand. Jack had himself rowed to it with Stephen, and as they walked on what sand there was, Daniel, the master's mate, came and said to Jack, "Sir, we have a hand in the boat, MacLeod, who was in Centaur in the year 4. He says the position here is very like what it was when Captain Hood took the Diamond Rock. He was a St. Kilda cragsman in his youth, and he helped to get the guns up the cliff." "It had not struck me," said Jack. "MacLeod!" he called, and the tall middle-aged seaman, a recent draft from Erebus in Gibraltar, came up, awkward and embarrassed. "Do you think you could take a line right up that cliff?" "I think so, sir," said MacLeod in his halting English. "This is no so steep as Diamond Rock." "Let us shove off at once," said Jack, and he led the way to the boat. The boatswain roused out coils of the strongest white line, the armourer blew his forge to an incandescent heat, fashioned wedges with eye-holes, and a little hand-pick under MacLeod's supervision. They were still too hot to hold as the boat pulled back, though in the meantime MacLeod and his cousin had sewn tight sailcloth climbing shoes. "God forgive me who dwells in the highest peak," said Stephen, standing with his hands behind his back, watching MacLeod's ascent. "But never have I seen such climbing. He might almost be a gecko." It was indeed an extraordinary spectacle. That stalwart 12-stone man, moving up the almost perpendicular lower cliff, fissured, to be sure, but from below apparently smooth, and when he reached a more craggy stretch where he could rest and then drive home his peg and make fast his line, all hands cheered amain. He tossed down his ball of twine for the next coil, and so carried on, faster this time, up to the middle height, while his cousin Alexander, making use of the first line, made his way up. In a surprisingly short time they were able to look cautiously over the top. The whole lagoon opened below them. Now began one of the most elaborate cat's cradles that Jack had ever seen. It was the boatswain's seventh heaven, and presently all was ready to send a 9-pounder cannon up, sliding along a steep messenger to the summit. That night the gun, its emplacement and its munitions, represented a prodigious amount of labour. But as the sun rose lighting the lagoon, with the galley up against its mole, nobody was in the least fatigued. Jack knew his gun intimately, but he'd rarely fired at such a downward angle. "I shall try 1 or 2 sighters," he told Stephen, who with Jacob had been carried up like parcels, "aiming at those dilapidated houses." 2 shots, and both went right home, and the Corsairs were swarming about the galley and the mole like startled ants. They very quickly grasped their situation. their hopeless situation, and seized Murad Rais. They manhandled him along to the end of the mole nearest the cliff, tied his hands, forced him to kneel, and called up, "Our sins on his head!" With a single blow, one of the Corsairs cut Murad's head clean off, held it up to the watchers on the cliff, and cried, "Our sins on his head! Give us water, and you shall have the galley and the gold!" There were fires all along the European side of the straits, exciting unspeakable wonder. At the sight of Gibraltar itself, ablaze with innumerable bonfires, the harbour filled with ships dressed over all, bands playing, trumpets blowing, and drums beating madly, checked all conjecture, and surprise having made her number, wafted silently to her usual place, with Ringle and the galley with its prize crew. "The flag-lieutenant, sir, if you please," said a midshipman at Jack's side. "Give you joy of your splendid prize, sir," cried the flag-lieutenant. "By God, you could never have timed it better." "Thank you, Mr. Betterton," said Jack, "but pray tell me what is afoot?" The flag-lieutenant stared for a moment. "Napoleon is beat, sir. There was a great battle at Waterloo in the Low Countries, and the Allies won." "Then it is I that give you joy, sir," said Jack, shaking his hand. "Have you any details?" "No, sir, but the courier has arrived, and the Commander-in-Chief will have them. And when your number was reported, he bade me remind you of your engagement. Please tell Lord Barmouth that Dr. Maturin and I shall be charmed to wait upon him. Above all, on such a day." "There you are at last, Aubrey," cried the Commander-in-Chief, obviously overcome by the events and somewhat flushed with wine. "Doctor, your servant, sir. Very happy to see you. So here you are, Aubrey, and with a thundering great prize at your tail. Give you joy, of course. But the fellow must have led you a most infernal long chase." "He did indeed, my lord." "Well, I congratulate you, but I wish to God you could have done it on any other day of Algiers. This one has cut up very rough indeed. Says it was his galley, and everything in it. Sent me a furious note, and swears he'll take it out of our merchantmen if there's no restitution, compensation, and the rest of it. But, my lord, the galley fired on us first. That made him a pirate and fair game." "That's not what the day says." "Was it a very large sum of money, Aubrey?" "I cannot say, my lord. It's in the form of gold ingots in chests that must tip the scale at 8 stone or more." "A hundredweight. How many chests were there?" "I did not count, my lord." "Well, it fairly makes me tear my hair thinking of my flag officer's third." Barmouth muttered under his breath for a while, then, recollecting himself, he said, "But it's far worse for you. And how you'll ever explain it to your people without a bloody mutiny, I cannot tell. But hush, the Keiths have just arrived." The door opened, and in walked the ladies, very fine ladies indeed, glowing with happiness, victory, and all their best jewels, followed by Lord Keith. "Jack!" cried the one, and "Dearest cousin Jack!" the other, and both kissed him most fondly. With the utmost affection and the happiest look, Jack said, "Queenie and Isabel and Queenie, how very delightful it is to see you both together, and in such glorious looks, my dears." The Commander-in-Chief took one end of the table, with Queenie on his right, and Arden, his political adviser, only just not late and still pale with emotion, on his left. Isabel Barmouth the other end, with cousin Jack on her right and Stephen on her left. When they were adolescents, there had been a certain degree of ambiguity about the nature of the friendship between Jack and Isabel. Now that ambiguity was distinctly more evident, and it was clear to Stephen that they were holding hands under the cloth. She was, Stephen reflected, something of a rake, a very pretty rake. And it was not improbable that her cross old husband was aware of it, for Lord Barmouth straightened in his chair and called down the table, Aubrey, I've just been thinking that now you have nothing to do with the Navy, you might be well advised to slip your moorings and sail off to survey the Horn and plumb the depths of Magellan." At this, a servant asked Stephen whether Dr. Jacob might have a few words with him. Stephen excused himself, and when he returned a few minutes later, he brought Jacob in with him. "My lord," Stephen said to Lord Barmouth, "may I introduce my colleague Dr. Jacob, a gentleman very well known to Sir Joseph Blaine?" "Here, here," said Arden. "Of course you may," said Barmouth. "How do you do, sir? Pray take a seat. May I offer you a glass of wine?" "My lords and gentlemen," said Jacob, bowing, "I must tell you that the forerunner of an Algerine delegation has brought me news of Ali Bey's deposition. He was strangled in the slave market. One of our most reliable agents in Algiers has just told me that tomorrow morning a delegation from the new day, Hassan, will arrive to congratulate His Majesty on the defeat of Bonaparte, to announce his own accession, and to settle a point at issue, the Algerine galley and its alleged cargo. He waives his predecessor's absurd claim, and although he should like the galley back as a symbol of his office, he fully acknowledges that its commander, in firing first, deprived all persons other than the captain of His Britannic Majesty's ship of any claim to its contents. He should, however, be most grateful for an immediate loan of £250,000 to consolidate his position in Algiers." There was a silence. Then the Commander-in-Chief said, "Dr. Jacob, we are very grateful indeed for your good news. We shall receive these gentlemen in a suitable manner." Jack felt a spring of delight rising in his heart, and the face of the Commander-in-Chief now shone with an inner sun. In the course of these last few minutes, his flag officer's third part of Jack's share of the prize, so recently despaired of, had returned as a solid, beautiful fact. Lord Keith was a good friend to Jack Aubrey. Very early in the morning he had a score of barrows alongside the Surprise. Under guard they wheeled the massy little chests to the premises of Gibraltar's 3 substantial goldsmiths, who reduced the whole to tested ingots of a stated weight well before the Algerine ship came in with its delegation and a present of full-grown ostriches. Jacob was present at the various ceremonies, but Jack and Stephen were wholly taken up with other things, Jack with storing his ship for the first leg of his voyage, while Stephen did much the same for his department, as well as writing a very long coded report to Sir Joseph. The ceremonies, it appeared, went off very well, particularly the state appearance of the loan on silver salvers. But with the Algerines gone, to the sound of guns, drums, and trumpets, when the Keiths came down to say goodbye, Jack and Harding found to their grief that they had not been able to keep all their people sober. It was none of it very gross, and even Queenie had seen a drunken sailor. Yet even so, Jack was relieved when the moorings were cast off, and Surprise, dropping her foresail, glided free of the mow. "God bless!" called Queenie. "Liberate Chile and come home as soon as ever you can," called her husband, while the children screeched out very shrill, fluttering handkerchiefs. At the very end of the mole, when the frigate turned westward along the strait with a following breeze, stood an elegant young woman with a maidservant, she too, waving, waving, waving.